Struggling to truly understand others, or even yourself sometimes? Empathy can feel like a riddle, full of twists and turns. This 3-hour experience offers a gentle, profound unraveling of those complexities, helping you find peace in the paradoxes of human connection. Let these insights softly carry you to sleep. Mirror pain effect. It begins as a flicker, so small you might mistake it for nothing. You see someone wince, perhaps a friend stubs their toe, or a stranger clutches their chest, and before you can think, something sharp jolts through your own body. Your brow tightens, your muscles twitch, and deep inside your brain, circuits flare that were never meant to activate unless you were the one in danger. This is the mirror pain effect, the invisible phenomenon where feeling another's suffering turns into a ghost of your own. We like to think of empathy as purely emotional, a swell of compassion, a soft ache in the heart. But science has shown that sometimes, empathy is physical. In a rare subset of people, witnessing someone else's pain doesn't just trigger sympathy, it triggers their own pain matrix. Their brain doesn't neatly separate them from me. The boundary blurs and the agony spills over. Neurologists have watched this unfold in fMRI machines. A volunteer sits still in the scanner. Outside the glass, they watch a video of someone's hand being pricked with a needle. In most people, regions linked to emotional empathy light up. The anterior insula, the anterior cingulate cortex. But in those with mirror pain, something else happens. The somatosensory cortex, the part that maps sensations on your own skin, activates as if the needle were piercing them. No wound, no physical contact. Yet their body reacts like it has been attacked. For some, it's subtle, a tingling in the same spot, a pressure in the chest when they see someone struck there. For others, it's overwhelming. Burning, stabbing, throbbing. These sensations aren't imagined in the way we think of fantasy. They are as real as any ache. In fact, the nervous system treats them as threats, pumping adrenaline, tightening muscles, heightening pulse. Empathy, in these moments, is indistinguishable from injury. This blurring of pain across minds hints at something profound about how we are wired. Humans carry mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we watch someone else perform it. They are part of why we flinch when we see someone almost fall, why we tense before a car crash on screen. But in mirror pain, the effect runs deeper, fusing action and sensation into one shared body map. It's as if the brain cannot bear the thought of another's suffering without trying it on for itself. There are stories that bring this into sharper focus. A woman once described how, while watching a soccer match, she saw a player's knee twist violently. Before she could react, a searing jolt shot through her own knee, so sudden she cried out. Hours later, she still felt soreness. A man with mirror pain spoke of how seeing news footage of disaster victims left him physically exhausted. Every bruise and cut mirrored somewhere on his own body. These aren't simply acts of imagination. They're neurological echoes. Some scientists see this as an evolutionary advantage. If your nervous system reacts to others' pain as your own, you might be quicker to aid them, to prevent harm spreading to yourself or your tribe. In the dangerous landscapes of early humanity, feeling another's injury as if it were yours could mean the difference between life and death. But in the modern world, where we witness suffering on screens every day, this adaptation can become a curse. Imagine living in a world where you cannot walk past a construction site without feeling the imagined thud of a hammer on your thumb, where watching a hospital drama leaves your body sore. For many with mirror pain, the only way to cope is to limit exposure, to avoid not just violent media, but even certain social settings. Empathy becomes an act of self-preservation, choosing when to let the world in and when to shut it out. But this also raises an unsettling truth. If our brains can mistake someone else's pain for our own, then the boundary between me and you is not as solid as we believe. Pain, it turns out, can be contagious, not metaphorically, but neurologically. Your suffering can live in my nerves and mine in yours. We are linked more intimately than we admit. The mirror pain effect forces us to confront the double-edged nature of empathy. To feel for someone is noble, to feel with them is powerful, but to feel as them, to carry their wounds in your own flesh, can leave scars that no one sees. Some bear those scars silently, unsure if they are a gift or a burden. This phenomenon has even been documented in the most unexpected places: courtrooms, accident sites, and among soldiers in battle. One soldier described seeing his comrade take a piece of shrapnel to the shoulder. Though he himself was unhurt, a sharp burning sensation erupted in his own shoulder at the exact same moment. He later learned nothing had physically touched him, yet his nervous system had convinced him otherwise. For the rest of that night, his arm throbbed in quiet solidarity. Researchers studying this effect have also noticed it in athletes. Gymnasts, for example, often report twinges in their own ankles while watching teammates land badly. Boxers sometimes feel flashes of jaw pain when their opponent is struck, even from across the ring. This is more than simple imagination. It is the brain rehearsing injury as if to prepare the body for it, a survival rehearsal that has outlived the dangers it was meant to serve. There are also darker stories where the mirror pain effect became too heavy to bear. One nurse working in an emergency ward found herself experiencing chest pains whenever a patient arrived with heart trouble. Over time, these phantom pains became so frequent and intense that she began having panic attacks. She left the profession not because she lacked compassion, but because she had too much. So much that it became physical harm. And here lies the paradox. The very mechanism that makes us human, that allows us to understand another's suffering, can also wound us without a single blow being struck. The mirror pain effect blurs the clean edges of individuality, showing that in some ways we are wired to suffer together, whether we choose to or not. Perhaps the most haunting part is that most people experiencing mirror pain cannot switch it off. It is not a decision. It is a reflex, a deep-rooted script running in the architecture of the brain. You cannot simply tell yourself, it's not happening to me, because in that instant, it is. And maybe, hidden beneath the discomfort, there is something beautiful. To carry even a fragment of someone else's burden, unasked and unseen, is to live as proof that empathy is not just a word, it is a physical truth written in nerves and blood. The cost is high, but so is the connection. Compassion, fatigue, loop. It begins quietly, almost invisibly. A tear in the mind's resilience so fine you can't see it until it spreads. At first, compassion feels like a gift, an invisible bridge between your heart and another's pain. You listen, you feel, you care. You let their words carve shapes into you, let their fears echo in your own chest. You think, this is what it means to be human. This is connection. But connection has a cost. The more you feel, the more of yourself you give away. And unlike physical wounds, the exhaustion of empathy is silent. It doesn't bleed or bruise. It settles in your bones, an ache that no sleep can cure. You wake, and before your feet touch the floor, you already feel heavier than you were yesterday. That heaviness is not laziness, not weakness. It's the residue of every story you've absorbed, every cry you've heard, every sorrow you've tried to hold for someone else. This is the compassion fatigue loop. The cycle where caring becomes draining, and draining becomes numbing. At first, the emotional weight feels noble, a burden worth carrying. You believe that every act of listening is a lifeline for someone else. But, over time, your mind begins to protect itself in the only way it knows how, by shutting doors. The emotions that once passed freely through you are now filtered, dulled, muted. You're still there, still present, but behind glass. People still see your face, still hear your voice, but they can no longer reach the depths of you. It happens to nurses in late-night hospital wards where the beeping of monitors blends into the quiet groans of pain and the smell of antiseptic becomes part of the air they breathe. It happens to firefighters who pull lifeless bodies from smoke-filled rooms and go home to silence because they can't bring themselves to speak. It happens to social workers who walk into homes filled with silent despair, who leave knowing they can't fix what's broken. It happens to the friend who always answers the midnight call, who becomes the keeper of everyone else's storms. At some point, the mind whispers, enough. And it's not cruelty, it's survival. The loop is insidious because it hides under the disguise of strength. You tell yourself, I can handle it. I've handled it before. But the truth is, every story you carry takes space inside you. And if you never empty it, you begin to drown in other people's oceans. You find yourself responding to tragedy with a practiced nod instead of a gasp, hearing heartbreak and feeling nothing but a dull echo. You start skipping certain phone calls, avoiding certain conversations, not because you don't care, but because you can't afford to care anymore without breaking. And this is where the loop tightens. You start to feel guilty for not feeling enough. You think, if I can't feel their pain like I used to, does that mean I've stopped caring? That guilt pushes you to try harder, to dig deeper into the well, but the well is already dry. The more you try, the more you scrape against the stone, until caring becomes an act of self-harm. You give, but it hurts you to give. You care, but it wounds you to care. And so, the cycle repeats. Pain for them, pain for you. Compassion fatigue doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've been human for too long without rest. It means you've stood too close to too many fires, warming others while your own skin blistered. It's the slow erosion of emotional availability, carved by a river that never stops flowing, even as you beg it to slow down. The mind, desperate to protect itself, builds walls where there used to be bridges, and you begin to watch life from behind them. The danger is that, in this state, you might mistake numbness for apathy. You might start believing you've lost your humanity, when in reality, your mind is trying to save it. Just as a body withdraws blood from the extremities to keep the core alive, the mind withdraws emotional energy from the edges to keep you from collapsing entirely. The tragedy is that this protective measure can feel like a betrayal of your own identity. You wonder, who am I if I can't feel the way I used to? There's a strange loneliness in compassion fatigue. You want someone to notice, to ask, how are you? But not in the casual way, not as a prelude to telling you their own troubles. You want someone to ask and mean it, someone to hold the weight for a moment so you can breathe. But those who see you as strong rarely imagine you might be breaking. They assume the helper never needs help. And yet, there's a quiet truth here. Compassion is renewable, but only if it's replenished. Just as fields must lie fallow to regain their fertility, the heart must have seasons of rest. To step away is not to abandon others. It's to preserve the part of you that can return to them whole. There's no shame in retreat. There's wisdom in knowing when to close the door, draw the curtains, and sit in the stillness that asks for nothing. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is admit you are empty. Imagine a candle lighting 100 others. The first few times, the flame burns steady, unwavering. But if the original candle is never shielded from the wind, never given a chance to recover its wax and wick, its light will falter. Not because it stopped wanting to give, but because it no longer could. And when it goes out, the room is darker than before, because it was the one that lit them all. In the end, breaking the compassion fatigue loop means allowing yourself to be a person, not just a vessel for other people's pain. It means remembering that empathy is not an infinite resource. It must be balanced with self-compassion, because if you burn out entirely, you can't light the way for anyone, least of all yourself. And perhaps that's the hardest lesson of all. You cannot save everyone. You were never meant to. But you can save the part of yourself that still wants to try, and that's enough to begin again. Suffering contagion syndrome. There are wounds that do not touch your skin, yet they leave you limping through the hours of your day. This is the strange, invisible collapse that happens when you stand too close to another person's pain. Nothing bad has happened to you, and yet you feel as if something inside has cracked. It is not your tragedy, not your grief, and yet your heart feels heavy. Your breath slower, your mind pulled into shadows that are not your own. This is suffering contagion syndrome, when the emotional pain of others seeps into you like a cold fog, without permission, without a single word spoken. It begins quietly. You meet a friend for coffee. They try to smile, but the weight behind their eyes is unmistakable. They speak of loss, a breakup, the death of a parent, the slow unraveling of their dreams, and as they talk, you feel something inside you sink. You listen because you care, because it's human to be there for one another. But when you leave, you notice your mood has shifted. The world seems duller. Your own life, which only an hour ago felt steady, now feels precarious, as though their suffering has infected your emotional stability. Science has traced some of this to mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you watch someone else perform it. They are the reason you flinch when you see someone get hurt, the reason you tear up at a sad movie. But when it comes to emotional pain, the mirroring runs deeper. Your brain doesn't just observe their grief, it partially simulates it. You begin to feel, in fragments, the despair they are feeling. It is as though the boundaries between minds thin, and their sorrow is poured directly into your nervous system. The effect can be so strong that you begin to anticipate pain before it arrives. Think of a nurse who has spent years working in an oncology ward, watching patients fight and sometimes lose. Even before a new patient says a word, the nurse may feel a wave of heaviness because their mind has been conditioned to expect tragedy in that environment. Or imagine a child growing up in a household where a parent is perpetually anxious, angry, or sad. The child learns to scan the emotional weather constantly, adjusting their own mood to match or diffuse the tension. They carry this skill into adulthood, but it is not a harmless adaptation. It is a constant draining of their own reserves. And here is the most unsettling part. You do not need to know the person to absorb their pain. A stranger crying on the subway can plant a stone in your chest that you carry for the rest of the day. An image of suffering, war victims on the news, a starving animal, can flatten your mood in seconds. Your body responds as if it has been personally wounded, flooding your bloodstream with stress hormones, tightening muscles, quickening the heart. You are not just imagining their pain, you are living a diluted version of it. But what makes suffering contagion syndrome dangerous is not just the empathy, it's the slow erosion of self that comes from constantly hosting emotions that are not your own. You can begin to mistake borrowed pain for your identity. Your days are colored not by your own experiences, but by the emotional residue of everyone you've been near. Like a sponge left in dirty water, you cannot help but absorb. And eventually, you stop noticing which feelings are truly yours. Consider the story of a man named Elias, a crisis counselor who spent a decade answering suicide hotlines. In the beginning, he told himself he was strong, that he could hold the pain without letting it touch him. But over the years, he found his dreams turning darker. He would wake with the voices of strangers in his head, recounting their despair. One night, after leaving a shift where 3 calls ended in silence, he sat in his car for hours, unable to move, feeling as though the despair in those voices was now his own. It was not that he had suffered their losses, he had suffered the echo of them, and echoes can be just as heavy. This syndrome thrives in silence. You feel heavy, but when someone asks what's wrong, you hesitate. How do you explain that nothing happened to you, and yet you are grieving? How do you admit that someone else's pain has taken up residence in you, like a ghost that refuses to leave? Many don't say anything at all. They withdraw. They smile less. They stop seeking joy. Not because their life has changed, but because they have been quietly infected by the sorrow of proximity. There is a danger in not recognizing this. If you mistake these absorbed emotions for your own, you may begin making decisions based on them, avoiding certain people, places, or risks, not because they are truly harmful to you, but because your mood is being shaped by wounds you never received. It is like steering a ship through a storm that isn't even in your waters. And yet, there is a strange beauty in it too. It is proof of our deep interconnectedness, the way our nervous systems are tuned to one another like strings on the same instrument. But even a beautiful song can become unbearable if it plays too long without rest. If you recognize this in yourself, the first step is to name it, to say, this sadness is not mine, this heaviness belongs to someone else. It doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you begin filtering what you carry. Sometimes you must put down the pain that is not yours so you can have the strength to help again tomorrow. Because without that awareness, suffering contagion syndrome turns you into an open window in a storm. Everything blows through, and sooner or later, the room inside is unlivable. Identity blur feedback. There is a moment, subtle but irreversible, when empathy stops being an act of connection and starts becoming an act of self-erasure. You think you are helping. You think you are understanding. You lean closer, your mind reaching out to meet theirs, your emotions softening to make space for their pain. But in doing so, you cross an invisible line, and on the other side, you are no longer simply feeling with them. You are feeling as them. Their wounds start to occupy the architecture of your own mind. Their grief becomes your grief. Their fears slip into the shadows of your own thoughts, and the borders between who you are and who they are begin to blur until they are almost gone. This is the phenomenon I call the identity blur feedback. It's not just empathy, it's not just compassion. It's something more invasive, something more consuming, like a psychic osmosis, where your emotional boundaries dissolve and their pain seeps in, settling into the deepest parts of you. And here's the catch. The more deeply you feel for them, the more your own identity starts to shift to accommodate their experiences. You no longer react as you react as both of you. And sometimes, in extreme cases, as only them. It often begins innocently. Imagine a close friend going through heartbreak. You sit with them in silence. You listen to the shattering in their voice, the pauses that last too long, the way their fingers curl into their palms when they think no one is looking. You start remembering your heartbreaks, your own times of loss, and for a moment you connect. But the more you listen, the more you watch, the more you absorb. And before long, it is no longer your memory you are recalling. It is theirs. You begin to feel their exact kind of emptiness, the precise shade of loneliness that belongs to their life, not yours. Now, imagine this feedback loop continuing for days, weeks, or years. You are not only carrying their feelings, but also making decisions based on them. You speak using their phrases. You think using their metaphors. Your worldview subtly tilts until it mirrors theirs. And if they are in pain, you are too, sometimes even more than they are. Because your brain, in trying to match their emotional state, can begin to amplify the signal, creating an echo chamber of shared suffering. Psychologists sometimes talk about emotional contagion, where feelings spread like a virus between people. But the identity blur feedback goes further. It doesn't just transmit emotion, it rewires the self. And the more empathetic you are by nature, the more at risk you are. People with high sensitivity, intuitive personalities, or a deep history of caregiving often fall into it without realizing. They think they are being strong, but in reality, they are dismantling their own emotional walls brick by brick. One haunting example comes from a nurse I once interviewed. She worked in a pediatric oncology ward, caring for children with terminal illnesses. Over time, she began dreaming in their voices. Her inner monologue started to sound like theirs. She found herself mourning children who were still alive, because she had fully absorbed the prognosis into her own emotional core. She said, "I didn't just hold their hands through the pain. I carried their pain inside me until I couldn't remember which was theirs and which was mine." Eventually, she left the profession, not because she stopped caring, but because she no longer knew who she was without their suffering to define her. This phenomenon isn't limited to caregivers. It can happen in relationships, in activism, in art. A writer immerses themselves so completely in a character's suffering that they lose touch with their own emotional reality. An activist fighting for victims of injustice starts to feel that every wound in the world is their personal injury. Even parents can experience it, merging their identity so completely with their child's that the child's failures or fears feel like proof of their own inadequacy. The danger is that once this feedback loop takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. The more you absorb, the more you lose yourself. And the more you lose yourself, the harder it becomes to recognize that it's even happening. Eventually, you might mistake their emotions for your own natural state, living in a constant haze of secondhand despair, fear, or rage. Breaking the cycle requires something deceptively simple, but painfully difficult. Boundaries. Not the cold, rigid kind that shuts people out, but the living, breathing kind that says, "I see you. I feel with you. But I am not you." This means learning to sit in the presence of someone else's suffering without letting it dissolve your own sense of self. It means practicing the art of compassionate separation, of being a steady shore without letting the waves carry you away. One technique is to visualize their pain as an object in the space between you, not a substance you must carry inside you. Another is to periodically step back and check your language. Are you saying, "I feel your pain," or "I feel my pain"? The distinction matters. Your nervous system needs that reminder. Without it, empathy can become a slow form of identity theft, one you willingly participate in. And yet, there is a paradox. The very thing that makes deep empathy so dangerous is also what makes it so beautiful, the ability to touch another life so profoundly that, for a moment, the line between you disappears. But beauty becomes harm when it consumes the whole. You can visit someone else's emotional world, but you cannot live there. To do so is to vanish. Because in the end, if you forget where you end and they begin, you risk becoming a ghost in your own life, haunting someone else's story, while your own slowly fades from existence. Empathy, rejection reflex. There is a strange and disorienting wound that does not bleed, but it stings in ways you cannot name. It happens in the quiet moments after you've reached out your hand, offered your voice, or opened your heart to someone in pain, only to have it pushed away, not gently, but with a force that makes you question the very purity of your intention. You meant to comfort. You meant to soothe. Yet the response you meet is hostility, coldness, or a wall of silence so thick it makes you feel as though you've trespassed into a place you were never meant to see. It begins with something as simple as a soft question, "Are you okay?" Or a quiet act, placing a blanket on someone's shoulders, sending them a message to say you're here. In your mind, it's an offering of warmth. In theirs, it might be an exposure of vulnerability they weren't ready for. Pain has a way of curling in on itself. And for some, another person's concern feels like a spotlight on a wound they'd rather keep hidden in the dark. To understand this, you have to step into the psychology of defense. Imagine someone who has spent years surviving through self-reliance, perhaps because every time they reached for help in the past, they were met with disappointment, betrayal, or mockery. For them, help is not safety, it's risk. Your compassion, no matter how sincere, can awaken the memory of past humiliations. It's not you they are rejecting. It's the ghost of everyone who ever failed them. Sometimes, the rejection is sharp and obvious. They snap, "I don't need your pity," or "mind your own business." The words sting, but what cuts deeper is the confusion that follows. You replay the moment in your head, dissecting every word you said, every tone, every gesture, wondering if you crossed an invisible boundary. Did you make them feel weak? Did your kindness feel condescending? Or did your presence simply arrive at the wrong moment, when their guard was highest? Other times, the rejection hides itself in silence. No response to your message. Averted eyes. The conversation changes direction with surgical precision, leaving your offering of care hanging in the air, unanswered. That silence can be even more painful than anger, because it leaves a vacuum for your mind to fill with doubts. You start to wonder whether your compassion is flawed, whether you've been misreading human signals your entire life. The empathy rejection reflex is not only born of past wounds, it can also emerge from shame. When people are hurting, they often feel exposed, raw, and inadequate. Your empathy can act like a mirror, reflecting emotions they are desperate not to see. If they already believe they are undeserving of kindness, your gesture can make that belief flare into something unbearable. Instead of receiving your care, they may reject it violently to protect their sense of self. In more complex situations, your compassion might touch on a truth they are not ready to face. Imagine a friend who is in a toxic relationship. You see their pain, you reach out, you offer comfort. But in doing so, you also implicitly acknowledge that something is wrong. That acknowledgement forces them to confront a reality they have been avoiding. The easiest way for them to escape that discomfort is to reject you, the messenger, rather than the truth itself. It's tempting to think the solution is to stop caring, to build your own armor so you never feel the sting again. But the reality is, empathy is not a transaction. It is a risk. Every time you extend it, you are stepping into unknown emotional terrain, where the response is never guaranteed. Sometimes it will be met with gratitude. Other times it will be met with the slam of an emotional door. Neither reaction is entirely about you. The challenge is to learn the art of compassionate detachment, to offer your kindness without anchoring your worth to how it is received. This means recognizing that rejection often says more about the other person's wounds than about your intentions. It means understanding that your role is not to force someone to accept care, but to make it available without condition. But here's the harder truth. Sometimes the empathy rejection reflex will wound you so deeply that you hesitate the next time you see someone in pain. You'll feel the phantom sting of past rejection, and you'll think, maybe they don't want me involved. And in that hesitation, you risk becoming one more silent witness to suffering. That is why it matters to stay open, even when the world teaches you to close. There is no perfect way to navigate this reflex. You will misstep. You will overreach. You will be misunderstood. But if you can hold on to the knowledge that compassion is not invalidated by its rejection, you will remain a light in a world that desperately needs it. Even if that light is sometimes turned away, it still exists. And one day, someone will be ready to step into it. The empathy rejection reflex will never stop hurting. But perhaps the measure of your humanity is not how often your kindness is accepted, but how often you offer it despite the risk. Because in the end, every act of care is a message sent into the unknown, carrying the hope that somewhere, someone will receive it. And that, in that moment, they will know they are not alone. Isolated understanding trap. There is a certain kind of silence that feels heavier than words, the kind that settles between two people who both know exactly what is happening but cannot acknowledge it. You've felt it before, when your eyes catch the tremor in someone's voice, the way their gaze lingers a fraction too long on nothing, the tiny shift in posture that betrays what they will never say out loud. In that instant, you understand them completely. Not just the story they tell, but the one they don't. And yet, instead of relief, what comes is distance. This is the isolated understanding trap. It happens when empathy ceases to be a bridge and becomes a mirror they cannot look into. You think understanding will bring closeness, but for some, being understood is not comfort, it is exposure, and exposure feels like danger. There are people who survive by being unreadable. Their defenses are not just habits, they are survival strategies honed over years. To have someone see past them, to have their unspoken truths named, is to strip them of the very armor that has kept them safe. Your empathy, no matter how gentle, becomes the sharp edge of a scalpel. You might notice it in small moments. You comment softly on something they thought they'd hidden. You seem tired, or I can tell this is bothering you. They laugh it off. They change the subject, but the air shifts. The connection you thought you were building closes like a door in your face. What you saw was real, but your seeing it has made them retreat deeper. This can be agonizing for the one who understands. We are taught that empathy is always good, that seeing someone for who they really are is an act of love. But love is not always received as it is given. In the isolated understanding trap, the more you see, the more they hide. Your insight becomes the thing that pushes them away. Sometimes, the reason is shame. They do not want their pain confirmed because confirmation makes it harder to deny. Sometimes, the reason is pride. They have built their identity around the idea that they can handle anything alone, and your understanding threatens that. And sometimes, it is simply fear. Fear that if you see the real them, you will leave. There are countless examples. A child who has learned to smile through hardship because any display of vulnerability was met with punishment. An artist who hides the true meaning of their work behind abstraction, only to bristle when someone names it aloud. A friend who jokes about their loneliness, but freezes when you point out that the laughter doesn't reach their eyes. You can feel the moment your understanding becomes unwanted. It's like stepping into a room where the light is too bright, where every imperfection is suddenly visible. Some people will close the curtains themselves, others will walk out entirely, and you are left standing there, holding knowledge you cannot unlearn, watching the distance grow. The cruelest part is that your empathy might have been exactly what they needed, but not in the moment you gave it. For someone who has lived in shadow, stepping into light is blinding. They may need time to adjust, to trust that you will not use what you see against them. But that trust is not guaranteed, and in the meantime, your closeness becomes isolation. The isolated understanding trap is a reminder that empathy is not just about what you see. It is about when and how you let someone know you see it. Some truths cannot be handed to someone. They must be arrived at on their own. Sometimes, the most loving thing is to understand in silence, to hold the knowledge gently without pressing it into the open. And yet, this silence has its own cost. To see someone's pain and say nothing can feel like betrayal. To name it and have them turn away can feel like rejection. You are left in a strange purgatory, both connected and cut off, bound to someone by an invisible thread that neither of you will acknowledge. Perhaps the hardest lesson is this. Understanding someone does not give you the right to be understood in return. They may never explain why your insight unsettled them. They may never admit you were right. They may even resent you for seeing what they had worked so hard to hide. And you must carry that quietly, knowing that empathy, like light, can warm or it can burn, depending on when it falls. This trap can appear in the most intimate of relationships, between lovers who know each other's micro-expressions too well, between siblings who have shared every formative wound, between old friends who can read a mood in a single syllable. The problem is that intimacy magnifies the effect. When someone realizes you can decode them without effort, they may begin to feel not cherished, but surveilled. One man described how his marriage ended not because of infidelity or anger, but because his wife felt he saw too much. Every time she tried to mask her frustration, he named it gently, thinking he was helping. Over time, she began to feel she had no private corner of her inner life. She told him, in the final days, that she needed space not from him, but from his understanding. Even in professional settings, this can happen. A therapist who correctly identifies a patient's unspoken fear too early can cause them to shut down, their trust shaken by the speed at which their inner walls were breached. A leader who senses an employee's hesitation and calls it out might think they are offering support, but the employee feels trapped under a microscope. The trap is not about whether you are right, it is about whether they are ready. Empathy moves at two speeds, the one who sees and the one who is seen. If you move faster than they can bear, the thread snaps. And so the skill lies not in the depth of your perception, but in the patience to let the truth arrive on their terms. Sometimes that means holding your tongue, even as the weight of what you know presses to be spoken. It means recognizing that seeing someone is not the same as being invited to look. The isolated understanding trap is a paradox. The very quality that can bring souls closer can also drive them apart. In its grip, you may find yourself wondering whether your insight is a gift or a curse. But perhaps it is neither. It is simply a tool, one that must be wielded with timing as much as tenderness. And maybe, just maybe, the deepest form of connection is not to be the first to understand someone, but to be the one who waits in the dark with them until they are ready to step into the light. Trauma echo resonance. It starts as a flicker, a sudden tightening in the chest when you hear someone else's story, a detail in their voice, a certain word, a pause before they continue. Something small but sharp catches in your mind, and without warning, you are not just listening to their pain. You are back inside your own. This is trauma echo resonance, the phenomenon where empathy doesn't just connect you to another, it opens the locked doors of your own past. You step into their moment, but the floor beneath you shifts, and suddenly you are standing in two timelines at once. Their sorrow becomes a bridge to your own, and the line between their pain and my pain begins to dissolve. You might not even realize it at first. You tell yourself you're just being a good listener, that you're simply understanding what they're going through. But inside, something begins to stir, like an old photograph left too long in the sun, its colors reappearing faintly. You remember the smell of the air that day, the sound of footsteps, the way the world looked just before everything changed. A soldier hearing another's account of battle might suddenly feel the grit of sand in his teeth, the sound of distant shelling ringing in his ears, even though he is thousands of miles away in a quiet cafe. A survivor of abuse might hear a friend describing an argument and, without warning, feel the heat of that old fear crawl up their spine. The body doesn't just recall the memory, it relives it. The heart beats faster, the skin grows cold, and the mind becomes a projector replaying scenes you never asked to see again. Trauma echo. Resonance is not weakness. It is the nervous system recognizing patterns, the brain linking what it hears now to what it endured then. In the deep architecture of the mind, emotional memories are never truly stored away. They rest, dormant but intact, waiting for the right sound, scent, or story to bring them roaring back. The disorienting part is how the timelines blur. You may be sitting in a safe, calm room, but your body reacts as though you are in danger. It can feel like time folds in on itself, then and now occupying the same breath. You are both comforter and wounded, listener and survivor, protector and child in need of protection. The words you speak are for them, but the tremor in your voice is for you. This resonance can create a profound connection. When someone sees that your eyes glisten at the exact moment theirs do, when your pauses match their silences, there is a mutual recognition, a silent acknowledgement that the world has hurt you both. But the cost is heavy, because every time you meet someone in their grief, you also meet yourself in yours. And sometimes you are not ready to see that reflection. Some people live in a near constant state of this echo. Therapists who hear hundreds of stories that brush against their own histories. Activists fighting battles that remind them of the first wound that made them fight at all. Friends who are the strong one in every group, unaware that their strength is built on bones that never fully healed. And there is a strange paradox here. The very thing that makes you so empathetic is also the thing that reopens your scars. The bridge between you and others is built from the same wood that once splintered in your hands. And every time you walk across it, you feel the old cracks beneath your feet. The mind tries to cope. Sometimes it builds distance, wrapping your heart in numbness so you can keep listening. Other times, it lets you feel everything, flooding your chest until you're gasping on emotions that are not entirely your own. The danger is in not knowing when the floodwaters belong to you and when they belong to them. And if you can't tell the difference, both drown you. Healing from trauma. Echo resonance is complicated because the empathy it creates is a gift you may not want to lose. You don't want to harden. You don't want to close yourself off from understanding others. But you also cannot keep bleeding every time you open the door. The answer is not to tear down the bridge, but to reinforce it, so you can walk across without falling through. That might mean grounding yourself in the present while listening, touching something solid, naming objects in the room, feeling your feet on the floor. It might mean taking space after conversations that strike too close to home, allowing yourself to tend to your own wounds before tending to someone else's. It might mean talking to someone who can hold the echoes with you so they don't reverberate endlessly inside. Because in the end, trauma echo resonance is a reminder. Your empathy is shaped by your own history. You feel so deeply for others because you know, in some form, what they carry. But that knowledge comes with a responsibility, not just to them, but to yourself. To recognize when the past is whispering too loudly. To give yourself permission to step back when the echoes threaten to become deafening. You are not just a witness to their story. You are the keeper of your own. And both deserve to be heard without either one drowning the other. Delayed empathy trigger. Sometimes, when someone shares their pain with you, you nod, you listen, you respond the way you know you should. But inside, you feel strangely untouched. The moment passes. You think you have escaped the weight of it. You tell yourself you are strong, perhaps even cold enough not to let it get under your skin. But then, when the room is quiet and the day is far behind you, the delayed impact arrives. It hits not like a passing thought, but like a tidal wave that has been silently building far out at sea. You find yourself gripped by emotions you didn't feel when the story was told, as though the sorrow had been hiding in your bloodstream, waiting for the right moment to erupt. This is the delayed empathy trigger, the strange phenomenon where another person's suffering bypasses your immediate emotional defenses, only to surface later, raw and overwhelming. It is a kind of ghost pain of the heart, where the wound is not yours, but the ache is entirely real. In the moment, the human brain sometimes chooses survival over compassion. When you are face to face with someone's grief, your nervous system may quietly shield you, numbing your feelings so you can stay composed. This is especially true in situations where breaking down would be impractical or even dangerous. First responders, soldiers, doctors, and parents often learn to keep their emotions locked away in the heat of the moment. But the mind does not erase what it has absorbed, it only stores it in a deep vault. And, like a vault with a timer, the lock eventually opens. It can happen hours later, in the middle of an unrelated task. You could be making coffee, driving home, folding laundry, and suddenly, you are drowning in the weight of what someone told you. Their words replay with perfect clarity. Their tone, their trembling hands, their breaking voice, it all floods back. And now, without the adrenaline of the moment to protect you, you feel everything they felt. It is as if time itself conspired to deliver the pain at the exact moment you were most unguarded. There is a cruel elegance to this delay. In real time, you might think you were unaffected, maybe even heartless. But the truth is, your empathy was simply postponed. It is like a letter sent in the mail rather than delivered by hand. The message arrives later, but its impact can be even more devastating because it catches you off balance. Consider a paramedic who responds to a car accident. In the chaos, blood, sirens, shouted instructions, they feel nothing but focus. They load the injured into the ambulance, pass them to the hospital staff, and return to duty. But 2 days later, while sitting alone at home, a small detail resurfaces. The way a child in the back seat had been clutching a stuffed animal. In that moment, the dam breaks. They are no longer in their living room. They are back at the scene, hearing the cries, smelling the burnt rubber, feeling the helplessness they didn't allow themselves to feel before. The delayed empathy trigger is not always dramatic. Sometimes it creeps in during the quiet hours of the night when the mind wanders and memories resurface. A friend's confession of heartbreak might echo in your mind days later, suddenly sharp enough to make your eyes sting. An old story someone told years ago might rise without warning, making you ache as though it happened yesterday. This delayed reaction can be both a gift and a curse. On one hand, it allows you to be present and composed in moments when your steadiness matters. On the other, it can blindside you when you least expect it, making ordinary moments feel suddenly unbearable. You cannot predict when the wave will hit, and when it does, you cannot outrun it. It has been traveling toward you for days. Psychologists believe this delay often comes from a form of emotional processing known as deferred affect. Your mind takes in the sensory and emotional data of the moment, but puts it aside until it feels safe enough to process. The problem is, safety does not mean readiness. By the time you feel it, the emotion has been amplified by time, by imagination, and by your own empathy filling in the blanks. This can be especially haunting when the person who suffered is no longer present. Maybe you heard a stranger's story on a train and will never see them again. Maybe the friend who confided in you has already moved on, but you are only now feeling the impact of their pain. You are left holding an emotion with no one to give it back to, no way to release it except to carry it until it fades. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the delayed empathy trigger, that we are not always aware of how deeply connected we are to each other in the moment. Sometimes our humanity speaks in whispers that only reach us long after the conversation has ended. It is a reminder that empathy is not a performance to be delivered on time. It is a force that can breach any wall on its own schedule. When it happens, the best you can do is let it in. Let it pass through you, knowing it came not because you are weak, but because you are deeply, unavoidably human. Hyperempathic collapse. There is a point where feeling too much stops being a gift and starts becoming a slow, silent destruction. It doesn't happen all at once. It begins with an openness, an ability to read the subtle shifts in someone's voice, the flicker in their eyes, the heaviness in their posture. You sense emotions like other people sense temperature. Anger feels like heat against your skin. Sorrow feels like a weight on your chest. Joy is a sudden rush of light inside you. And at first, it feels like a superpower. But a superpower comes at a cost. Because when you feel everything, you don't get to choose what you carry. You feel the elation of a stranger's good news, but you also feel the quiet despair of the man across the room who's trying not to cry. You feel the unspoken tension between a couple on the train, the panic of a child separated from their parent in a crowd, the fatigue in the cashier's smile, and you can't turn it off. Your nervous system is constantly decoding, absorbing, and translating the emotional signals of everyone around you, as if the world is speaking through 100 different radios, all tuned to different stations, but they are all playing in your head at once. This constant bombardment doesn't just drain you, it rewires you. Your body starts to live in a perpetual state of readiness, constantly adjusting to the emotions in the room. Your heart rate shifts, your breathing changes, your muscles tighten or loosen, depending on what you pick up from others. And the more you feel, the harder it is to locate your own emotions in the noise. Somewhere along the way, you stop asking, "How do I feel?" Because the answer is always tangled with everyone else's energy. For some, this becomes a lifelong pattern. For others, there is a breaking point. Psychologists call it empathic distress burnout, but I call it the hyperempathic collapse. The moment when your nervous system, overloaded by constant emotional data, shuts itself down to survive. It's not dramatic. There's no warning alarm. One day, you simply notice you've gone numb. Someone cries in front of you, and you feel nothing. Someone laughs, and it doesn't move you. Your inner channels have gone quiet, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've cared so much for so long that your system has flipped the breaker to keep you alive. A woman once told me she used to be the emotional anchor for her family, the one everyone came to in a crisis. She would absorb their pain, give them comfort, and walk away feeling drained but fulfilled. Then, after years of this, she went to her sister's hospital bed after a miscarriage. She held her sister's hand, saw the tears, heard the shaking in her voice, and felt nothing. "I watched myself sitting there," she said, "like an actor who'd forgotten the script. I didn't know how to respond because there was nothing left inside me to give." She didn't know it then, but her body had decided to protect her by shutting off her empathic response entirely. This collapse can look like emotional detachment, irritability, or a sudden craving for isolation. It's not that you've lost your capacity for empathy, it's that your mind has locked it in a vault, inaccessible until it believes it's safe to open again. And sometimes, it never fully does. The cost of prolonged hyperempathy can be a permanent narrowing of emotional bandwidth, a protective scar over a once wide-open channel. But why does this happen? Imagine your empathy as a river. In a healthy state, the current flows steadily. You can step in, feel the water, even swim for a while. But when you are hyperempathic, you are not standing by the river. You are living in it, every moment, with the current pulling at your body, carrying pieces of you downstream. Over time, the constant force erodes your strength. You keep swimming until one day your body decides, sink or shut down. And so, it shuts down. There is another danger here. When you lose the ability to feel others deeply, you can also lose the ability to feel yourself deeply. The emotional colors of life fade to grays. You may stop doing things you once loved because they no longer spark joy. You may avoid people, not out of dislike, but because you can't bear to risk the weight of feeling their pain again. And yet, paradoxically, you might still find yourself seeking out intense emotional environments, almost like a phantom limb of your empathy, reaching for sensations it can no longer process. Recovery from hyperempathic collapse isn't about cutting off empathy. It's about learning to regulate it. That means creating emotional boundaries that aren't walls, but filters. It means giving your nervous system time to reset between exposures. For some, this means meditation, grounding techniques, or limiting time in high-intensity emotional spaces. For others, it means therapy, not to fix empathy, but to rebuild the ability to feel without drowning. One man I knew began painting after his collapse. At first, he painted in black and white, saying color felt dishonest. But slowly, over months, color returned to his work. Small strokes of red, then blue, then gold. He told me he could measure his recovery by how much color he was willing to put on the canvas. It wasn't that he became less empathic. It was that he learned to visit emotions like a traveler instead of living inside them as a permanent resident. The truth is, hyperempathy is both a blessing and a curse. It can make you the most trusted friend, the most intuitive partner, the most compassionate stranger in a room. But left unchecked, it can consume you from the inside out. The key is not to turn it off, but to learn the rhythm of stepping in and stepping back, of feeling without dissolving. Because in the end, empathy is like fire. It can warm, or it can burn. And if you burn too long without rest, the collapse will come. Not because you are weak, but because your body, in its quiet wisdom, knows you cannot carry the whole world and still survive being yourself. Empathic projection error. There is a subtle but dangerous trap in empathy, one that hides beneath the warm belief that we understand another person's pain. It happens when you look at someone's situation. Imagine yourself in their place, and then feel certain you know what they must be feeling. You speak to them as if your emotional landscape is theirs, as if your mind and heart would react exactly the way theirs do. And yet, you may be wrong, entirely wrong. This is the empathic projection error, the illusion that your own internal reactions are a universal blueprint. It begins innocently. You hear a friend has lost their job, and immediately you feel a sinking heaviness. If it were you, you'd be devastated, anxious about the future, maybe even ashamed. You carry those feelings into your tone, your words, your presence. But when you speak, your friend shrugs and says, "Actually, I'm relieved. I hated that job." In that instant, you feel an almost physical misalignment. Your compassion was aimed at a wound that didn't exist. You tried to treat a pain they weren't feeling. This error is not just about mismatched emotions. It is about the deep human tendency to use ourselves as the default template for understanding others. Our memories, values, and fears shape our expectations of how pain, joy, loss, or change should feel. We assume that what would devastate us must devastate others, that what would bring us joy must bring them joy. But the inner world of another person is not a mirror of our own. It is a terrain shaped by their unique history, personality, culture, and beliefs. You may recognize the landmarks, but the meaning of each place is theirs alone. Sometimes, this misalignment creates awkward moments. You may try to comfort someone for something they don't consider a problem. Or worse, you might minimize something that is tearing them apart because it wouldn't affect you in the same way. Imagine a scenario. A colleague is deeply upset about a small criticism from a manager. You think, why are they overreacting? I wouldn't care about that. But for them, that criticism might echo a lifetime of never feeling good enough. By projecting your own emotional template, you not only miss their reality, you risk invalidating it. The empathic projection error can also happen in reverse, assuming someone is fine because you would be fine in their place. This is particularly dangerous in moments of hidden suffering. Think of someone going through a breakup. You might think, it's just a relationship, they'll move on. But for them, that relationship might have been the anchor that kept them from feeling adrift in the world. Your dismissal of their pain, even if unspoken, creates a canyon between you, one they may never try to cross again. At its core, this error comes from confusing empathy with imagination. True empathy requires listening before imagining, absorbing before interpreting. Projection, on the other hand, skips the listening. It fills in the blanks with your own story, your own feelings, and assumes they fit. The tragedy is that projection can feel like empathy in your own mind. You feel certain you're being compassionate, but the other person may feel unseen, misunderstood, or even invalidated. One of the most painful outcomes of this error is that it can erode trust. If someone repeatedly experiences your empathy as inaccurate, they may stop confiding in you. They may think, they don't get me. They're not really listening. And once that belief sets in, even genuine efforts to connect may be met with guardedness. There are also cultural layers to this problem. What feels humiliating in one culture may feel inconsequential in another. What feels like freedom to you may feel like abandonment to someone else. Without awareness of these differences, empathic projection can become a form of emotional imperialism, imposing your emotional truth on someone whose inner world does not match yours. Avoiding this trap requires humility. The humility to admit that you do not automatically know how someone feels, even if you've been in what looks like the same situation. It requires curiosity, the willingness to ask, how does this feel for you, rather than assuming the answer. And it requires patience, the restraint to hold your own imagined feelings at bay until you've heard theirs. But perhaps the hardest part is unlearning the comforting illusion that our own mind is a reliable map for others. It is not. Each human mind is its own country, with borders, languages, and customs that may look nothing like your own. The empathic projection error is what happens when you walk into that country, assuming everyone speaks your language. This doesn't mean you should doubt your instincts entirely. Your own emotions are valuable tools for guessing at another state, but they are starting points, not conclusions. They are hypotheses to be tested through presence, listening, and openness, not verdicts to be declared. If you can learn to step back from projection and into genuine, patient listening, something changes. Your empathy becomes more precise, more attuned, more healing. You stop giving people the care you think they need and start giving them the care they are actually asking for. Sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, sometimes in ways you would never have imagined. The empathic projection error is a reminder that empathy is not about seeing yourself in someone else. It's about seeing them as they are, even when that view is nothing like your own. And in a world that so often tries to simplify the complexity of human feeling into familiar shapes, there is something deeply powerful about saying, I don't just see me in you, I see you. Pain comparison spiral. It starts with the best of intentions. Someone sits before you, spilling the raw edges of their pain, how it kept them awake last night, how it's been tightening around their ribs for weeks, how the weight has become almost unbearable. You listen, and somewhere inside, you feel that pull of empathy. You want to show them you understand, to prove they're not alone. So you reach for the closest bridge you know, your own suffering. I know what you mean, you say. When I went through my breakup, it felt like I couldn't breathe. You mean it as connection. You mean it as solidarity. But something in their expression changes. Just slightly. They nod, but their eyes harden. And without realizing it, the conversation shifts. Their pain is no longer the center. It is now part of a quiet, unspoken measurement. Whose wound is deeper? This is the pain comparison spiral. It begins with empathy and ends in a silent competition no one admits to playing. Sometimes it's subtle. You share your hardship. They counter with theirs. You mention how grief felt like drowning. They reply that they've been under for years. Soon, neither of you is speaking to be heard. You're speaking to be validated as the one who has endured more. What began as connection becomes a tally, and the higher the numbers climb, the further you drift from the original purpose of the conversation. In its worst form, the spiral can turn toxic. Pain becomes a currency, and every story must be outbid. One person's hardship isn't met with understanding, but with a darker, heavier anecdote. Something that says, I've suffered more, so I understand better. But the truth is, suffering doesn't scale neatly. Pain is not a race you can win. It is a storm you survive, and each storm has its own shape. The psychology behind it is messy. When we relate our own pain, we often think we're closing the gap, saying, I've been where you are. But for someone who is speaking from the center of their suffering, what they hear instead is, this isn't about you, it's about me now. In that instant, their story becomes smaller, overshadowed by yours. It's not always intentional. Sometimes it comes from a need to prove empathy is real, to reassure the other person you're not just nodding politely. Other times, it comes from insecurity, an urge to demonstrate that you too have known darkness, that your experiences give you the authority to comment. But even when meant in kindness, it can backfire. The focus shifts from their pain to pain itself. And once that happens, the conversation is no longer about healing. It's about ranking. You see this spiral in friendships, where a confession about burnout becomes a volley of exhaustion stories, until both people are comparing sleepless nights like war medals. You see it in families, where generational trauma becomes a point of pride. Parents telling children, you think you have it bad? When I was your age? You see it online every day, where people respond to vulnerability with one-upmanship, drowning out the original voice under an avalanche of louder tragedies. And yet, the most dangerous version is the internal one. It's when you try to empathize with someone else, but start measuring your worthiness to feel pain at all. If theirs is worse, you tell yourself you have no right to hurt. If yours is worse, you begin to resent their fragility. Either way, comparison poisons the space where empathy should live. Breaking the pain, comparison spiral takes restraint. It means resisting the urge to reach for your own story right away, even if you think it will help. It means letting their pain exist without needing to weigh it against anything else. It's not about suppressing your own experiences, it's about giving theirs room to breathe before bringing yours into the light. True empathy is not a trade of wounds. It's the act of standing in the space of someone's hurt without trying to repaint it in your own colors. It's saying, I'm here, not, I've been there too. Because sometimes the most powerful connection is not the overlap, but the recognition that their experience is singular, valid, and fully theirs. There is a strange irony in the pain comparison spiral. Both people may leave feeling unseen. The one who shared their pain feels it was diminished by comparison. The one who offered theirs feels misunderstood for trying to connect. Both are left wondering why the conversation that was meant to bring them closer only deepened the distance. The truth is, empathy does not require matching scars. It doesn't require proving you've suffered equally or more. It requires listening without the need to insert yourself into the center. When someone shows you their wound, they are not asking you to open yours. They are asking you to witness theirs without flinching. And maybe the most difficult lesson of all is this. You can carry your own pain without putting it on the table every time someone else lays down theirs. You can have walked through fire and still choose not to tell that story in the moment. Because sometimes the most healing thing you can give another person is not your similarity, but your silence. The kind of silence that holds space, without measurement, without competition, without the need to win the war of who's more broken. Genetic empathy, bias. It's a quiet truth most of us don't like to admit, that the heart doesn't weigh every life equally. We tell ourselves we are fair, that we care for all people the same. But somewhere beneath the conscious mind, ancient instincts still whisper in the language of survival, help those who are like you first. And in that whisper lies the genetic empathy bias, the tendency to feel stronger empathy toward those who look, sound, or live like us. It begins in the biology of tribes and kinship. Long before cities and borders, your ancestors lived in small, tightly bonded groups. Survival meant recognizing who belonged and who did not. Those who shared your features, your dialect, your customs, were more likely to be allies. Those who did not were more likely to be strangers, and strangers could mean danger. Across thousands of generations, this pattern left an imprint, not just in our stories, but in our brains. Today, the world is vast and interconnected, yet that old wiring hums in the background. When you see a face that mirrors your own in some way, skin tone, facial structure, familiar clothing, your brain responds with a subtle surge of warmth. When you hear a voice shaped by an accent like yours, your trust rises before you even realize it. When someone's lifestyle reflects your own values or environment, you feel a sense of kinship, as if they are part of your unspoken circle. And the reverse is also true. Empathy can falter when the face is unfamiliar, when the voice carries an accent your ears do not know, when the customs seem foreign. The suffering of the stranger can feel more abstract, more distant, not because it is less real, but because the deep evolutionary wiring struggles to see them as part of us. Without meaning to, you might picture their pain as something happening far away, behind glass. The bias reveals itself in subtle, everyday moments. A disaster strikes in your own city, and your chest aches with urgency. You picture the streets you walk, the people you might pass tomorrow. But when a similar tragedy occurs in a country you've never visited, with names you cannot pronounce, the ache may be quieter. You might care, you might donate, but the instinctive punch of emotion is softer. Your mind processes their suffering as if it exists in a different emotional universe. It shows up in the workplace, where managers unconsciously mentor employees who remind them of their younger selves and overlook others whose background feels unfamiliar. It shows up in classrooms, where a teacher gives more patience to a child whose family mirrors their own. It shows up in jury boxes, in hospitals, in refugee policies. Anywhere compassion must be translated into action. And often the translation is not neutral. The genetic empathy bias is not a moral failure so much as it is an unexamined inheritance. Your brain was not built to comprehend the suffering of 8 billion people. It was built to protect a few dozen familiar faces. But in a world where lives are interconnected, this bias can become a quiet injustice, an invisible scale tipping toward those who already resemble you, and away from those who need your understanding just as much. This doesn't mean the bias is unbreakable. Empathy, unlike instinct, can be trained. Exposure reshapes perception. When you spend time with people whose faces and voices differ from yours, their features stop feeling foreign. Their customs stop feeling strange. Your brain, once cautious, begins to reclassify them as familiar. And with familiarity comes deeper empathy, as if you have redrawn the circle of who belongs. But breaking the bias requires confronting it honestly. It means noticing when your sympathy burns hotter for one group than another, and asking yourself why. It means challenging the comforting idea that all your compassion is equally distributed. It means realizing that fairness in feeling does not come naturally. It must be built, step by step, against the grain of history. The truth is, empathy is both beautiful and flawed. It is the force that has kept humanity alive and the force that can divide it. The same instinct that makes you risk your life for your child can make you look away from someone else's. The same warmth that draws you toward those who share your reflection can make you blind to those who don't. To overcome the genetic empathy bias is not to erase difference, but to expand your sense of kinship until difference is no longer a barrier, until the stranger's face is no longer strange, until the sound of an unfamiliar accent carries the same music as your own, until the suffering across the ocean feels as urgent as the suffering across the street. And maybe that is the real test of compassion, not how easily we love those who are like us, but how fiercely we can learn to love those who are not. Because empathy, in its truest form, is not an echo of similarity. It is a bridge across distance, built by choice, not instinct. And that bridge is the only thing wide enough to hold the weight of all of us. Emotional time warp. There is a strange dissonance that can happen between two people, an invisible lag in the way compassion travels. You hear someone's story and you are pulled into their past, into the raw moment of their suffering. You feel it as if it is unfolding right now, as if the wound is still open. But when you look up, you realize they have already moved on. They have closed the chapter, stitched the wound, and placed it on the shelf of memory. Your empathy has arrived late, misaligned in time, leaving you carrying an emotion that no longer belongs to them. This is the emotional time warp, the moment when your compassion is tuned to a version of someone that no longer exists. It is as if your heart is speaking to their ghost while the living person stands before you, unshaken. It often happens with old stories, told casually. A friend recalls their worst heartbreak from years ago, laughing now as they share the details. To them, it is a relic, a thing to be examined without pain. But to you, hearing it for the first time, the wound feels fresh. You picture the nights they cried, the emptiness they felt, the silent moments of despair. And without meaning to, you feel that ache on their behalf. An ache they no longer feel themselves. Sometimes, the misalignment is even more intense when you see physical evidence from the past. A photograph of them in a hospital bed, an old message written in despair, a journal entry from their darkest year. These artifacts collapse the distance for you. They make the pain immediate and vivid. Yet for them, these things are artifacts of a different lifetime, stripped of their sting. You are reacting to an emotional storm that has long since passed over their sky. The consequence of this time lag is subtle but powerful. You might treat them gently as though they are fragile, when in truth they have long since regained their strength. You might hesitate to bring up certain topics, imagining them too painful, not realizing they speak of them now with ease. You might even mourn for them, carrying a sadness for a version of them that no longer exists, while they walk beside you unburdened. The strange thing is, sometimes they do not even want you to feel this empathy. They may be proud of having overcome it, of having emerged from the darkness without needing rescue. But your compassion, anchored to the past, cannot help but try to comfort them. Comfort they no longer need. In this way, the emotional time warp can be an unintentional intrusion, a reminder of pain they have chosen to leave behind. Consider the story of Mara, who survived a terrifying car accident a decade ago. Her recovery was long, but now she drives without fear, tells the story without trembling. One evening, over dinner, she describes it to a new friend. They listen wide-eyed, their hands tightening around the glass, heart pounding with imagined terror. When they speak, their voice is heavy with sorrow for her ordeal. But Mara feels no sorrow, only the faint detachment of memory. In that moment, she is living in the present, while they are lost in the nightmare of her past. It's not limited to trauma. The emotional time warp can occur even in smaller moments of life. Someone might tell you about a humiliating moment from high school that still makes you wince just hearing it, but they tell it with a grin, as if they're describing the antics of a stranger. They've outgrown the sting, but you, hearing it fresh, still feel it as a wound. Your emotional reaction belongs to their history, not their now. This disconnection reveals something profound about empathy. It is not always synchronized. Our hearts do not always align with the timeline of another's healing. Sometimes we meet people not where they are, but where they were, and we feel more for their former self than they do. And in that space, we can feel oddly alone, mourning for someone who has no interest in being mourned. This lag is not a flaw in you. It is the mind's natural response to vivid storytelling and human connection. When you imagine someone's pain, your body responds as though you are witnessing it in real time. Hormones shift, your heartbeat changes, your breath slows or quickens. You are there with them, except they aren't there anymore. And when that realization comes, it can feel strangely hollow, as though you have poured compassion into a vessel that no longer needs to be filled. In a way, the emotional time warp is a mirror of grief delayed. It is not that you are slow to feel, it is that you are feeling for a version of them that only exists in memory. And sometimes, holding that feeling can even be bittersweet, because in your mind, you are standing beside them in a moment when they most needed someone, even if they never knew you then. But beauty does not erase the loneliness of being the only one still feeling it. You may leave the conversation thinking about their suffering for days, while they may never think of it again. It creates an imbalance, one person weighed down by compassion, the other light and untouched. The challenge is learning to bring your empathy into the present, to recognize when your compassion is aimed at a shadow, and to gently redirect it toward the person standing before you now. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is honor their resilience instead of their suffering, to acknowledge how far they have come, rather than how deep they once fell. Because if you linger too long in the emotional time warp, you risk building a connection to someone who no longer exists, and missing the chance to truly know the person who does. Exhausted savior syndrome. It starts with the best of intentions. You want to help. You want to be the one people can turn to when the world feels unbearable. You're the person who answers the midnight phone calls, who shows up unasked with food, who sits in silence with a friend while their world collapses. You're the listener, the problem solver, the safe harbor. And in those early moments, it feels good, pure, almost sacred. There's a quiet pride in knowing you can be someone's anchor when the storm hits. But over time, something begins to change. The calls don't stop. The visits become more frequent. People start coming to you not only when things are bad, but whenever they need to spill the weight they can't carry alone. And because you care, because you've always cared, you take it on. Every fear, every disappointment, every heartbreak you absorb. It becomes part of you, settling into your body like stones in your pockets. And the heavier it gets, the less you notice yourself starting to sink. This is the exhausted savior syndrome. It's the hidden cost of being everyone's emotional backbone. At first, the role feels like a calling. You don't even think of it as a choice. You just respond. Oh, you have the ability to listen without judgment, to offer comfort without asking for anything in return. But the truth is, every act of emotional support is a transaction. Even if you don't ask for it, your mind and body expect something back. A moment of care, a fragment of rest, a sign that you too are being held. When that never comes, the balance starts to break. You start feeling tired in ways sleep doesn't fix. You feel a quiet resentment you don't want to admit. When someone tells you their problems, you still nod, you still comfort them, but somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispers, "What about me?" And because you've built your identity around being strong for others, you silence that voice. You tell yourself you're fine. You tell yourself you can handle it. But the truth is, you've been carrying more than you were built to hold. One woman described it to me like this. At first, being the strong one felt like my purpose. I thought, if I can take away just a little bit of someone's pain, then my own pain will matter less. But over the years, I realized I wasn't taking away their pain. I was just adding it to my own. She reached a point where she would lie awake at night, running through everyone else's problems in her mind like a checklist, while her own life quietly fell apart in the background. The exhausted savior doesn't break in an explosion. They fade. They start missing calls. They stop replying to messages. They avoid situations where they might have to be there for someone, not because they don't care anymore, but because there is nothing left in them to give. And yet, they feel guilty for stepping back. They've been the lifeline for so long that the idea of not being available feels like a betrayal. Psychologically, this is a form of compassion fatigue, but it's more insidious because it's wrapped in identity. If you've always been the helper, the rescuer, the one holding everyone together, then who are you without that role? This question traps many people in the cycle. They keep giving even when it costs them their health, their relationships, their sense of self, because the thought of stopping feels like disappearing. The worst part is that the people you've saved rarely see the toll it's taken on you. They see the strong exterior, the calm presence, the reassuring words. They don't see the moments you cry alone in the car, the exhaustion that makes you stare at the wall for hours, the way your body aches from the invisible weight you carry. You've taught them you can handle it, so they believe you can. And in some ways, you've believed it too. But there is a limit. There is always a limit. And when it's reached, the collapse comes quietly. You find yourself unable to care in the way you used to. Not because you've lost compassion, but because your reserves are empty. It's like trying to give someone water from an empty cup. You want to help, but there's nothing left to pour. Breaking free from the exhausted savior syndrome requires something many find harder than endless giving: receiving. It means letting yourself be vulnerable enough to accept help without guilt. It means admitting that you too have needs that matter. It means taking the risk of not being the strong one all the time, and discovering that people might still love you without the armor. One man told me that after years of holding everyone else up, he took a month-long break from his social circles. He didn't answer calls unless they were about him. He didn't offer advice. At first, he felt selfish, but slowly, he started to feel human again. I realized, he said, that I'd built my life around being useful to others, and I'd forgotten how to be a person outside of that. The world didn't end when I stopped saving everyone, and for the first time in years, I felt light. The truth is, being there for others is beautiful, but it's not sustainable if it comes at the expense of your own existence. You can't save people from drowning if you are sinking under the surface yourself. Real compassion is not just about giving. It's about staying whole enough to keep giving without disappearing. Because in the end, the savior who burns out doesn't save anyone, not even themselves. Numb empathy, illusion. There is a peculiar and unsettling form of empathy, one that wears the costume of compassion but is hollow on the inside. On the surface, you appear attentive, caring, even moved. You say the right words, nod at the right moments, and reflect back the right emotions. But inside, there is nothing. No warmth in the chest, no ache in the heart, only the cold machinery of logic running its calculations, constructing the perfect facsimile of connection. This is the numb empathy illusion, the ability to imitate understanding without ever feeling it. It often begins as self-protection. Perhaps you've been exposed to too much suffering, your own or others, and somewhere along the way, the constant flood of emotion became too much to carry. So your mind built a dam. It didn't cut off your ability to understand people, it cut off your ability to feel them. You still see the shapes of their emotions. You can name them, predict their movements, even respond in ways that look comforting. But the raw, unfiltered current of empathy no longer passes through you. It is rerouted into intellect, where it is dissected, categorized, and returned in safe, measured doses. This illusion is especially dangerous because it can fool not only others, but you yourself. You tell yourself you care because you're acting like someone who cares. You tell yourself you're connecting because the other person smiles or thanks you. But if you're honest, if you're brutally honest, you notice that there's a glass wall between you and their pain. You are on the other side, observing, analyzing, responding, but never touching. For some, this numbness emerges from burnout. Doctors, therapists, social workers, and caregivers often face it. After seeing hundreds of people cry, break, or beg for help, the brain learns to protect itself by flattening the emotional spikes. The empathy becomes procedural, almost scripted. You still function, sometimes even more efficiently than before, because you're not weighed down by feeling. But the cost is invisible. The erosion of genuine human connection. For others, the numb empathy illusion comes from trauma. If, in your own life, feeling deeply once led to unbearable pain, your mind may decide that feeling is dangerous. It may choose to engage only through intellect, creating an emotional firewall. You still understand people, you may even be better than most at reading them, but your understanding is like light bouncing off glass. It illuminates, but it never warms. One of the clearest signs of this illusion is that your empathy is always perfectly appropriate. It never runs too hot or too cold. You never choke up unexpectedly, never lose composure, never feel that rush of uncontrollable emotion when someone else's suffering hits too close to home. Everything you say is measured, thoughtful, and balanced. To the outside world, this may look like emotional maturity, but to you, it can feel like acting in a play you've rehearsed too many times. The numb empathy illusion also affects relationships in subtle but profound ways. A partner might feel that you don't really care, even if you insist you do. Friends might stop sharing vulnerable truths because they sense an absence they can't name. Over time, people may drift away, not because you said the wrong thing, but because they never felt your presence in the way that matters most. Breaking through this illusion is not easy because it requires confronting the very reasons you built it. It means asking yourself when you last truly felt someone else's pain, not just noticed it, not just acknowledged it, but let it inside you. It means allowing cracks in the glass wall and risking the flood you've been avoiding. And that can be terrifying. One step is to slow down. Numb empathy often thrives in speed. Quick responses, quick nods, quick reassurances. When you slow your pace, you give yourself room to notice whether you're actually feeling or just performing. Another step is to sit with your own emotions, even when they're uncomfortable. If you've spent years avoiding your own pain, you've likely been avoiding others as well. There is also a paradox here. Sometimes the first step toward regaining real empathy is admitting you don't feel it right now. Telling someone, "I want to understand, but I'm struggling to feel this the way I think I should," can be far more honest and connecting than delivering a flawless but empty performance. The danger of the numb empathy illusion is not only that it keeps you from others, but that it convinces you you're still connected. You can go years, even decades, without realizing you've been living in a simulation of compassion. And when you finally see it, there can be grief for the connections you never truly made, for the people who needed you to feel, not just to respond. But there is also hope. Emotional numbness is rarely permanent. Just as it is learned, it can be unlearned, slowly, gently, by giving yourself permission to feel again in small, safe doses. By letting in one drop of real feeling at a time, until one day you notice the current is flowing again. And when that day comes, you'll remember what it's like to not just understand someone's pain, but to hold it in your heart as if it were your own. Because empathy without feeling is a mask. Empathy with feeling is a bridge. And bridges, unlike masks, can carry us to each other. Empathy loop paralysis. It begins as a strength. You listen closely. You notice the words people choose and the silences they leave behind, the invisible lines connecting their choices to their wounds. You don't just hear their story, and you inhabit it. And then you turn, and you can do the same for the other side. Their story, too, makes perfect sense. Their fears are justified. Their actions are explainable. And that's when it happens. The empathy loop paralysis. You see both sides so clearly that you cannot move. Every perspective feels valid, every truth feels real, and suddenly to act in favor of, one feels like betraying the other. It can happen anywhere. A friend group fractured by an argument, a family split over a decision, a workplace caught in a quiet war between colleagues. You stand in the middle like a translator between two languages, hearing the nuance in each tongue, knowing the pain in every syllable. And yet, the more you understand, the harder it is to choose. Because choice means erasing half the truth. To outsiders, it looks like indecision. To you, it feels like loyalty being stretched until it frays. You want to defend both sides, to show each that the other is not the villain they believe. But the deeper you go, the more tangled it becomes. You start building arguments for both cases in your head, refining them, polishing them, until your mind is a courtroom where you are the lawyer for the prosecution and the defense, simultaneously. It's exhausting. You may even begin to lose sight of your own position. At first, you think you're withholding judgment out of fairness, but soon, you can't remember which way you lean. Every time you feel yourself deciding, you remember the counterpoint, the other wound, the other fear. And just like that, you are back in the center, balancing truths like fragile glass in your hands, terrified that favoring one will cause the other to shatter. The paralysis deepens when both sides trust you. They come to you privately, telling you things they wouldn't share with the other. They make you the keeper of their pain, the guardian of their perspective, and the more they confide, the heavier it becomes, because every new piece of truth is another weight pulling you down into stillness. Sometimes, it's not even about conflict between people. It's about the collision between values, justice and mercy, honesty and protection, loyalty and self-preservation. You can see the merit in each, but they cannot coexist without loss. And when every path leads to betraying something you value, the safest choice seems to be no choice at all. But no choice is still a choice. Over time, the empathy loop paralysis can erode you. The people around you start to lose patience. They see you as passive, as unwilling to take a stand. They don't understand that your inaction isn't from apathy. It's from caring too much. They can't see that inside, you are walking the fault line between worlds, trying to stop the ground from splitting further apart. The danger is that the loop doesn't end when the situation ends. Once you've trained yourself to hold all perspectives equally, you may find it difficult to decide anything at all. Your empathy becomes a constant negotiation. Your thoughts a never-ending spiral of yes, but, and what if they're right too? You start to feel that any decision, no matter how small, will tip the scale against someone's truth. Breaking free from the loop doesn't mean abandoning empathy. It means accepting that empathy and action are not enemies. You can see both sides and still choose one. You can acknowledge someone's truth without making it your own. Sometimes, the most compassionate act is to act at all, to relieve the tension, to give the conflict an outcome, even if it costs you someone's approval. Because inaction often hurts everyone more than the imperfect decision would. The hardest part is living with the grief of the choice you didn't make, the truth you couldn't protect. But that is the nature of life outside the loop. Every decision is a small betrayal of one possibility in order to honor another. The empathy loop. Paralysis is not weakness. It's the side effect of seeing the human story in its entirety. But stories need endings, and endings require someone to turn the page. Emotional overstay reaction. It often begins with good intentions. You see someone hurting and you step forward, not just to offer help, but to stay with them in the darkness to make sure they're not alone. You listen closely. You check in often. You send messages, sit beside them, ask how they're feeling again and again. You believe your presence is a kindness, a lifeline. But kindness has a boundary, and sometimes you cross it without realizing. This is the emotional overstay reaction, the moment when empathy lasts too long, when your care begins to feel like a weight, when the person you're trying to comfort feels not supported, but watched. It's not always obvious when the shift happens. In the beginning, they might welcome your closeness, relieved that someone is truly listening. But grief and pain have their own private corners, places that even the most well-meaning companion isn't meant to enter. And when you stay too long in those corners, you risk turning their sanctuary into a space of performance, where they feel they must manage not only their own feelings, but also your investment in them. They may start to feel smothered, as if your empathy is no longer about them, but about your need to be part of their healing. The more you hover, the more your presence becomes something to navigate, instead of something to lean on. They may grow resentful, not because they don't appreciate your care, but because they feel their pain is being crowded, shared too heavily, examined under too bright a light. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room, trying to process a painful memory, and someone keeps opening the curtains to check on you. They mean well, but the light becomes exhausting. You long for the shadows again, the privacy to grieve, to think, to breathe without being observed. The emotional overstay. Reaction is a paradox. The same persistence that can save someone from isolation can also trap them in it. In staying too long, you risk taking away something vital, their sense of ownership over their own pain. Empathy becomes intrusion when it forgets that pain is not a shared possession, but a personal landscape. It happens in relationships when one partner tries too hard to fix the other's sadness. It happens in friendships when someone calls every day to check in until the calls feel like a burden. It happens in therapy when a counselor pushes past the point where the client wants to talk. It happens anywhere someone mistakes constant presence for constant help. The truth is, care must breathe. It must give space for silence, for distance, for the person in pain to decide when and how to invite you in. Staying endlessly can signal, without meaning to, that you don't trust them to stand on their own, even for a moment, and that can wound in its own way. Breaking free from the emotional overstay reaction means learning to read subtle cues, the slight hesitation before they answer, the way they say, "I'm fine," without making eye contact, the pause that comes when they want to be alone but don't know how to say it. It means resisting the urge to fill every quiet with your voice or presence. It means trusting that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back. Healthy empathy is a rhythm. It leans in when needed and steps away when the moment calls for it. It knows that being there for someone is not about endless hours together, but about the right moments in the right measure. Because love is not proven by how long you stay. It's proven by how well you understand when to go. And if you can leave without leaving them feeling abandoned, you've not withdrawn your care, you've strengthened it. You've shown them that your empathy is not a chain that binds, but a bridge they can cross when they choose. And maybe that's the deepest kindness of all, to know when your presence has done its work, and to let them have the quiet to find themselves again. Emotional fire transfer. There is a dangerous kind of empathy, one that doesn't simply understand another person's pain, but takes it into your own body like a sponge soaking up gasoline. You don't just hear their words, you feel their fury, their grief, their panic. And in your attempt to soothe them, you end up pulling their fire into yourself. You calm them down, but now you are the one burning. This is emotional fire transfer. It happens in the moments when someone's feelings are too intense to contain, when their voice shakes, when their hands tremble, when the air around them feels like it's carrying static. You step in to steady them. You say the right words, you lower your tone, you let them vent, you offer your presence as a grounding force. And slowly you see their breathing slow. Their shoulders drop. The storm leaves their body. But it doesn't vanish. It doesn't dissolve into nothing. It comes to you. Science can explain part of this through emotional contagion, the way human nervous systems sync up with those around them. Your brain reads their cues, your body mirrors their posture, your heart rate matches theirs. As they unload their emotions, those feelings have to go somewhere, and your willingness to receive them makes you the target. In that moment, you're not just listening, you are absorbing. At first, you may not notice it. You tell yourself you're fine. You were calm, after all. You did your job as a friend, a partner, a colleague. But hours later, or sometimes minutes, you realize you are agitated for no clear reason. You find yourself replaying their words, feeling a heat in your chest that wasn't there before. You thought you were helping by taking their burden, but now the weight is sitting squarely on your own heart. Consider the parent who comforts a screaming child. The child's panic slowly ebbs, but the parent, heart pounding, now carries the tension that was in their child's body. Or the friend who talks someone through a breakup, absorbing the raw heartbreak in order to give them a moment of peace, only to find themselves sleepless and aching long after the call ends. Or the mediator in a conflict who diffuses an argument by letting one side pour their rage into them, leaving the room calm, but stepping outside with their own mind on fire. It's easy to dismiss this as nothing more than being a good listener, but the truth is more dangerous, because the human mind is not a perfect filter. You can't take in emotional energy without some of it becoming your own. In the same way a firefighter might come away from a blaze with burns and smoke in their lungs, you can't step into someone else's fire without carrying its heat with you. What makes emotional fire transfer especially dangerous is that it's often invisible to others. The person you helped might thank you, feeling lighter, calmer, more in control, but they rarely see the toll it takes on you. They don't know that in steadying their ship, you've taken on their storm. Sometimes this transfer happens deliberately. You may feel it's your role, your duty, to protect others from the full weight of their own emotions. You may step into that space willingly, knowing you can take it. But even the strongest person has limits. Absorbing too much, too often, can leave you burned out, bitter, or quietly drowning in feelings that were never yours to begin with. There's also a cruel irony in it. In calming someone else, you may prevent them from processing their own emotions fully. They may move on quickly because you took on what they should have released into the world. You become the storage place for emotions that never got to run their natural course. And just like heat trapped in a closed room, those feelings can build and build inside you until they scorch you from within. The toll is not just emotional, it can be physical. Studies have shown that sustained exposure to others' stress can raise cortisol levels, disrupt sleep, and weaken the immune system. When you take someone's emotional fire into your own body, you're not just playing with metaphors, you're altering your biology. And yet, there is a strange nobility in it. To willingly carry someone's pain or rage so that they can walk away lighter is an act of sacrifice. But, like all sacrifices, it demands a cost. Too many people pay it without realizing how much it drains them, until they are running on fumes, snapping at small things, wondering why they feel so heavy all the time. The solution is not to stop caring, but to learn how to let the fire pass through you instead of taking it in. To listen without clutching. To stay close without becoming the container. This might mean stepping back sooner than feels comfortable. It might mean recognizing when your own reserves are too low to help. It might even mean letting someone sit with their own discomfort instead of rescuing them immediately. Because without boundaries, emotional fire transfer can become a cycle. You calm one person and take their heat, then carry it into the next interaction, passing it on like a hidden flame. In this way, a single spark of rage or grief can travel from person to person, burning everyone in its path. If you felt this, you know it's real. The heaviness in your chest after helping a friend, the sudden exhaustion after mediating a fight, the restless, angry energy that lingers after someone else has calmed down. It's not weakness, it's the cost of being human enough to care and open enough to receive. But fire, once taken in, has to go somewhere. And if you don't release it, it will consume you. Misguided moral sink. It doesn't happen in a sudden flash of revelation. It's slower than that. Quiet. Almost invisible. It begins with a connection, an understanding so deep that you find yourself leaning in. Listening not just to the words someone says, but to the rhythm underneath. The private logic that makes their choices make sense to them. You hear their pain, their history, their reasons. And in that empathy, you start to trace the lines of their moral compass, until you realize you're holding it in your own hands. At first, it feels harmless. They tell you about a decision they made, one you might not have made yourself. And you think, well, given what they've been through, maybe that was the right thing for them. You adjust. You understand. You bend. And each time you bend, you notice it gets a little easier. Their way of seeing the world starts to feel less like their way and more like the way. This is the beginning of the misguided moral sink, when empathy stops being a bridge to understanding and becomes a rewiring of your own ethical map. You don't just understand where someone is coming from. You begin to travel there yourself, until the distance between their values and yours collapses entirely. Sometimes it's obvious. You might find yourself defending their choices to others, even when those choices make you uneasy. You might hear your own voice using their justifications, their phrasing, their worldview. Other times, it's subtle. A small compromise here, a blind eye there, a quiet acceptance of something you once believed was wrong. And every step feels justified because you aren't doing it for yourself. You're doing it for someone you care about. I knew a man who became close friends with someone from his past, a person who had made questionable decisions, even illegal ones. Over time, the friend shared his perspective, the injustices he'd faced, the betrayals, the way the world had forced him into those choices. My acquaintance understood. He felt the pain behind the actions, and slowly, he stopped seeing them as wrong at all. When that friend crossed another legal line, he didn't object. In fact, he helped cover it up. Not because he wanted to break the law, but because in his mind, loyalty to his friend had become a higher law than any other. That's the power and the danger of syncing your moral compass with someone else's. What makes this so dangerous is that it doesn't feel like corruption. It feels like compassion. It feels like loyalty, solidarity, even love. You tell yourself you're not abandoning your principles. You're simply expanding them to include theirs. And yet, with each expansion, the edges blur. You no longer stand where you once stood. You're standing somewhere else entirely. But because you arrived there step by step, you don't realize how far you've drifted. This isn't limited to friendships or romantic relationships. It happens in families, in workplaces, in political movements. A cause you once saw from the outside pulls you in. You begin to empathize with its leaders, to feel their urgency, to share their outrage. And in that shared passion, you stop questioning methods you once would have rejected. You stop asking if the end justifies the means, because you've already decided the end is worth anything. The misguided moral sync thrives in close emotional proximity. The more you care about someone, the more likely you are to align with them, even against your own instincts. Your brain, wired for connection, begins to treat moral agreement as a requirement for emotional closeness. Disagreeing feels like betrayal. So you agree, even when that agreement twists something inside you. One woman told me she stayed in a toxic relationship for years because she believed her partner's moral code was simply different. He believed in ruthlessness in business, in exploiting weaknesses, in always putting himself first. At first, she told herself she could love him without adopting those beliefs. But slowly, she started seeing the world through his lens. She began to admire his manipulation as cleverness, his coldness as strength. By the time she left, she said, "I didn't recognize myself anymore. I wasn't just loving him, I was becoming him." Breaking out of a misguided moral sync requires a painful act of self-confrontation. It means holding your own moral compass up to the light and asking, is this really mine anymore, or did I trade it for someone else's? It means being willing to risk distance, conflict, even the loss of a relationship in order to stand in your own ethical ground again. And perhaps the hardest part, it means accepting that love, empathy, and understanding do not require agreement. You can feel someone's pain without endorsing their actions. You can stand beside them without walking their exact path. The tragedy of the misguided moral sync is that it begins with the best parts of human connection, the willingness to see the world through another's eyes. But those eyes are not your own, and if you look through them for too long without looking back at your own, you can forget the shape of your own sight. In the end, empathy is meant to be a bridge, not a merger. It should let you visit another's moral world without abandoning your own. Because when your moral compass spins in sync with someone else's without question, you may both end up lost, together, but far from where either of you should be. Ghost grief paradox. There is a strange kind of grief that belongs to no one, yet you carry it as if it were carved into your own bones. It appears suddenly, sometimes in the quiet moments after hearing a news story, or while scrolling past a stranger's obituary. You never met the person. You never shared a single memory. And yet, their absence presses against your chest with the weight of a personal loss. This is the ghost grief paradox, mourning for someone else's loss as if it were your own, even when the threads between you are made of nothing but air. At first glance, it makes no sense. How can you grieve for a life you never touched? The logical mind insists that grief must be tethered to personal connection. But emotion does not obey the rules of logic. it moves according to a different gravity. Sometimes, that gravity pulls you toward a story, a face, or even just a name, and before you can explain why, you are drowning in sorrow that does not belong to you. Part of the paradox lies in the human mind's capacity for imagined connection. When you hear of someone's death, especially in tragic, unjust, or sudden circumstances, your brain begins to build an image of their life. You imagine their laugh, their voice, the way they might have looked on an ordinary afternoon. You picture their family's grief, the empty chair at the dinner table, the birthday they will never see. And in those imagined moments, your heart forges a false history, one that feels as real as any you've lived. Another piece of the puzzle is empathy's strange ability to leap across the boundaries of personal experience. You don't need to have known someone to feel the shape of their absence. When you read about a young artist who died before their work could flourish, you feel the weight of lost potential. When you see a photo of an elderly couple separated by death after decades together, you feel the shattering of a bond you never witnessed being built. In these moments, empathy collapses the distance between their loss and your loss until the difference seems meaningless. But ghost grief is not always born from compassion. It can also rise from the haunting recognition of your own mortality. Every death is a reminder that life is fragile, that one day you and everyone you love will be reduced to memory. The stranger's death becomes a rehearsal for your own losses, a preview of griefs yet to come. In this way, ghost grief is both an act of mourning for another and an act of preemptive mourning for yourself. Sometimes, ghost grief attaches itself to symbols rather than individuals. The death of a public figure you never met might still feel personal because they represented something larger, an era, a movement, a possibility. Their absence signals the end of more than one life. It marks the closing of a chapter in the collective story. You may grieve not just for them, but for the version of yourself that existed while they were alive. This paradox can also appear in more intimate but still indirect ways. A friend loses a sibling, and you find yourself aching as if you lost one too. You attend a funeral to support someone else, but by the end you are sobbing harder than the family. You don't just witness their grief. You inhale it, let it settle in your lungs until it feels indistinguishable from your own. Ghost grief can be unsettling because it blurs the line between empathy and intrusion. Is it an act of deep human connection to feel so strongly for someone you never knew? Or is it, in some quiet way, taking on a grief that is not yours to carry? The truth may be both. Grief is not a finite resource. Your mourning does not diminish the mourning of others. But it does require awareness to ensure that in feeling alongside them, you are not centering yourself in their loss. The danger of ghost grief is that it can lead to emotional exhaustion. When every tragedy feels personal, the weight can become unbearable. You may find yourself avoiding the news, steering clear of stories that might hook your heart. Or you might begin to feel numb, as if the only way to survive is to stop letting yourself be moved at all. Yet there is also a strange beauty in this paradox. To grieve for a stranger is to acknowledge the invisible threads that bind all human lives. It is to admit that no one is truly isolated in their joy or their sorrow. Your grief, even for someone you never knew, is a quiet rebellion against the idea that we are alone. Perhaps the task, then, is not to reject ghost grief, but to learn how to hold it lightly, to let yourself feel the ache without being consumed by it, to let it remind you of the fragility and value of life, and to channel it into acts of kindness for those who are still here. Because while the person you grieve is gone, the compassion their absence stirred in you is not, and that compassion can be passed forward like a living memorial. Ghost grief will always be a paradox. It is grief without history, mourning without memory. But it is also proof that the human heart does not always wait for permission to care. Sometimes, it grieves simply because it recognizes the universal truth that every life matters, and every loss ripples far beyond the circle we can see. Fragmented empathy conflict. It begins with something simple, a disagreement between two people you care about. Maybe it's a sharp exchange in a group chat. Maybe it's a cold silence at a dinner table. At first, you think you'll be able to help. You know them both, you understand how each thinks, and you're certain that if you just listen, you can bridge the gap. But as you step closer, something unexpected happens. You feel their pain in equal measure. You understand their words, their fears, the private history that shaped their reactions. You can hear the tremor in their voices, not just the anger, but the hurt beneath it. And suddenly, empathy doesn't pull you toward one, it pulls you toward both. This is the fragmented empathy conflict. It's the moment when your compassion divides like a river splitting at the fork, flowing equally toward two opposing shores. Your heart no longer beats in unison. It beats in fragments, one piece aching for them, another for the other. You want to support them both, but the nature of the conflict demands that choosing one feels like turning your back on the other. It's not like being neutral. Neutrality implies detachment. This is the opposite. You are fully attached to both. You feel their hurt as your own, twice over. Every word from one side lands inside you and shakes loose the empathy you feel for them. But the same happens when you turn to the other. You become a mirror that reflects both realities, and that mirror starts to crack. Sometimes it's a disagreement over values. One believes in protecting tradition, the other in breaking it. You understand the comfort of what's familiar, but you also understand the necessity of change. Both are right in ways that matter, and both are wrong in ways they can't yet see. Sometimes it's a personal rift, a broken promise, a betrayal, a misunderstanding that's been allowed to fester. You've heard the private stories from each side, the details they wouldn't dare share in the same room. You know the secret reasons behind their choices, the quiet moments of guilt they'll never admit. You've been entrusted with truths that make it impossible to fully condemn either one. And that's when the conflict becomes yours too, because now, no matter what happens, you will lose something. If you stand beside one, you will wound the other. If you try to stand between them, you will be pulled apart. And if you step away entirely, both will feel abandoned. The emotional toll is heavier than you expect. You might find yourself rehearsing conversations in your mind, imagining ways to gently defend one without attacking the other. You might wake up in the night thinking about what you could say to make them understand each other. And when you speak to either one, you edit yourself constantly, afraid that even a stray word could reveal the empathy you feel for the other. Over time, this balancing act begins to erode you. You become hyper-aware of tone, timing, and even facial expressions, how much warmth you show to one compared to the other. You fear that they can see the fracture inside you, that your divided loyalty is written in your eyes. And then comes the worst moment, when both sides begin to test you. Not always consciously, not always cruelly, but they watch for signs. They notice if you pause before agreeing, if your defense of them is softer than it used to be. They feel the shift. And once they sense you're not fully theirs, the trust starts to fray. In the fragmented empathy conflict, you realize that empathy is not always the great unifier we imagine it to be. Sometimes, it's a force that binds you to opposing poles, stretching you until you're no longer sure where you stand. It is possible to love and understand two people whose truths cannot coexist, and the human heart, for all its resilience, struggles to survive that tension for long. Escaping the fracture isn't about choosing who's right. It's about accepting that empathy is not ownership. You can feel deeply for someone without making their fight your own. You can honor the truth you see in each of them without taking responsibility for resolving their collision. Because in the end, no matter how much of yourself you pour into understanding them, the resolution isn't yours to create. It's theirs. And sometimes, the most loving act is to step back far enough for them to face each other without you standing in the middle, absorbing the blows meant for someone else. The fragmented empathy conflict teaches a harsh truth. Empathy is powerful, but it is not infinite. Split it too many ways, and you risk losing not just the connection to others, but the connection to yourself. And when that happens, the only way forward is to gather the pieces of your heart back into one place, even if it means letting someone feel for a while that you've chosen a side. Unspoken pain synchrony. It can happen in a moment so brief that you can't explain why you noticed it. They walk into the room smiling, words light and casual, but something in the air shifts. Their shoulders are just a little tighter than usual. Their laugh lands half a second too late. There's no confession, no sigh, no visible crack in the mask, but you feel it anyway, like a faint tremor beneath your feet. This is unspoken pain synchrony, the quiet, uncanny alignment between your emotions and someone else's suffering that they never put into words. You're not responding to what they say. You're responding to everything they don't. It's not mind reading. It's the body's ability to pick up on micro signals, the subtle vibrations in another person's tone, posture, and presence. The way their voice carries a thin thread of strain beneath the casual flow. The way they pause before answering, as if deciding which version of the truth to give you. The way they turn their head just slightly away when the conversation brushes too close to something raw. Sometimes, it's a bond forged over years, knowing someone so deeply that you can detect a storm behind their eyes, even when they are doing everything to hide it. Other times, it's an instinct that leaps across unfamiliar ground. You've only just met. Yet, something in your gut says they're carrying more than they're showing. You might respond without thinking. Your voice softens. Your questions slow. You give more space between words. Or maybe you reach for a joke to lift the weight you felt but not named. Sometimes you even find yourself aching, restless, unsettled, mirroring an emotion you can't identify until you realize it belongs to them, not you. The strange part is how often they deny it. You ask if they're okay, and they smile, insist everything's fine. And in that moment, you're caught in a delicate balance. How much do you push? How much do you honor their silence? Because there's a difference between sensing pain and being invited to witness it. To push too far risks turning care into interrogation, but to step away feels like leaving them alone in a storm you've already felt on your own skin. Unspoken pain. Synchrony can be both a gift and a burden. It allows you to be present for someone before they even realize they need it, but it can also leave you holding emotions that aren't yours, heavy and shapeless, without a clear place to put them. And when it happens often, it can drain you in ways you don't notice until you're too tired to feel your own emotions clearly. Some of the deepest connections in life are built on this silent recognition. A friend sits beside you in total quiet because they know speaking would be too much. A stranger holds your gaze just a second longer than necessary. And in that moment, you know they've understood something about you that you haven't said aloud. No words. Just a mutual acknowledgement that pain, when shared in this invisible way, doesn't always need to be spoken to be heard. But the truth is, sensing unspoken pain doesn't mean you're responsible for healing it. Sometimes the only thing you can do is offer a presence that feels safe, a space without pressure, a reminder, without saying so, that you see them. And if they want to open that door, you'll be there. Because unspoken pain synchrony is not about extracting confessions. It's about honoring what your heart has noticed, while respecting what theirs isn't ready to share. And in that balance, something remarkable happens. The person begins to feel less alone, not because you've solved anything, but because you've understood without demanding proof. And maybe that's the rarest kind of empathy, the kind that listens not to words, but to the silences between them. Echo chamber. Empathy. Empathy is often celebrated as an unshakable virtue, the bridge between hearts, the quiet act that holds a fractured world together. We think of it as limitless, a light that can reach anyone, anywhere. But in reality, empathy can be quietly shaped by our choices, our surroundings, our comfort zones. Without noticing, you can begin to build walls around it, narrowing the space in which it works. You start surrounding yourself only with people whose lives, emotions, and struggles mirror your own, those you can understand without strain. And slowly the skill of reaching those who are different fades away. This is echo chamber empathy, the subtle trap where your compassion flows freely, but only within a carefully chosen circle. The people inside it are easy to relate to. They share your values, your humor, your cultural references. Their pain resonates because you recognize its shape from your own life. But outside the walls of this chamber are others whose lives are foreign to you, people whose beliefs clash with yours, whose hardships feel unfamiliar, whose way of expressing emotion confuses you. Over time, their suffering stops reaching you, not because you've chosen cruelty, but because you've lost the muscle to feel for what you don't understand. It starts quietly. You gravitate toward conversations where you don't have to explain yourself, where empathy is effortless. You choose friends whose opinions rarely challenge you, whose joys and fears make immediate sense. And when someone outside that comfort zone speaks of their pain, you feel a small but telling hesitation. Perhaps you nod politely, but deep down you don't feel the pull to comfort them, not the way you do for those inside your circle. That moment passes unnoticed, but it repeats. And each time it does, your empathy becomes more specialized, less universal. This narrowing is dangerous because empathy, like any skill, needs practice in all directions. If you only use it where it's easy, it will weaken where it's hard. You may still believe you are a compassionate person because you care deeply for those who remind you of yourself. But empathy for those who are like you is not the same as empathy for humanity. It's empathy for a reflection. And the more you live in that reflection, the harder it becomes to imagine life beyond it. Consider someone raised in wealth and stability. They might deeply empathize with a friend's career setbacks or a breakup because they have experienced something similar. But when a homeless man tells his story, they feel polite discomfort rather than deep connection because the shape of that suffering is alien to them. Or consider someone who has endured racial discrimination. They might connect instantly with others who share that pain, yet struggle to feel compassion for people outside that identity. In both cases, empathy has been narrowed, not by malice, but by familiarity. The digital world sharpens this effect. Social media algorithms feed you voices that match your own. Your online communities reflect your beliefs back at you, reinforcing what feels right and filtering out what feels strange. The posts you like, the causes you share, the stories that move you, all of them fit into the boundaries of your comfort zone. The ones outside it never appear in your feed, so they stop appearing in your mind. And without even realizing, you start believing that you care about people, when in truth, you care about your people. The most dangerous part is that you can still feel deeply emotional and believe nothing has been lost. You cry at your friends' struggles. You give time and money to causes you believe in. You listen attentively when your community suffers. But that depth becomes selective. The moment you're faced with someone whose worldview, appearance, or experiences are far from yours, your empathy falters, not out of rejection, but out of disconnection. And here lies the cost. The more your empathy is contained, the more the world feels divided. The other becomes easier to dismiss, easier to label, easier to dehumanize. You might even find yourself defending harm done to them because their pain doesn't register with the same vividness as the pain of those you relate to. Empathy that could have been a bridge becomes another wall, breaking out of echo chamber. Empathy is uncomfortable, by design. It means sitting with people whose stories don't instantly make sense to you. It means asking questions that might expose your own ignorance. It means letting go of the expectation that their pain should sound familiar in order to matter. It means being willing to feel for people even when their life choices, politics, or culture are in sharp contrast to your own. True empathy is not measured by how intensely you care for those who are like you. It is measured by how much you can extend that care to those who are not. Because if you only ever practice empathy where it's easy, you risk losing it where it's needed most. And one day, you may find that the warm, safe circle you've been standing in isn't just a comfort zone. It's a cage, and every wall is made of reflections of yourself. Asymmetrical empathy trap. It begins as something beautiful, a connection you believe is mutual. You see them in all their complexity, all their contradictions. You notice the small cracks in their voice when they talk about their past. You pick up on the things they don't say, the way they look away when certain subjects come up. You study them, not out of suspicion, but out of care. You want to understand them so completely that they never feel alone in their own mind. And for a while it feels like it matters. You listen, you comfort, you give. You let them spill their fears into your hands, and you hold them gently, as though they are fragile artifacts from a life you were never meant to see. You give your time, your energy, your emotional reserves, because in your mind, this is what connection is: mutual vulnerability, shared humanity. But slowly, a truth emerges. When you speak, their eyes are elsewhere. When you hurt, they don't lean in. When your voice wavers, there is no flicker of concern. You realize that the depth you feel for them is not mirrored back. You are looking through glass that they cannot or will not see through. This is the asymmetrical empathy trap, the state of caring deeply for someone who feels nothing or almost nothing for you. At first, you tell yourself it's fine. Not everyone shows emotion the same way. Maybe they care in ways you can't see. You hold on to moments, a small smile, a quick text, a half-hearted question about your day, and you inflate them into proof. You convince yourself that the mirror isn't one way, just dimly lit. But deep down, something inside you knows the truth. If you stopped showing up, the space you leave behind would not be felt in the same way you would feel theirs. One man told me he spent years as a silent emotional anchor for a friend who never once asked how he was doing. She would call him late at night, pour out her pain, and hang up without a single question about his own life. He told himself he didn't mind, that his role was to support, not to be supported. But over time, that one-way current hollowed him out. "I realized," he said, "that I wasn't her friend, I was her confession booth." This trap is especially cruel because empathy thrives on reciprocity. Our nervous systems are wired to respond to care with care, to comfort those who comfort us. When that cycle is broken, the imbalance starts to erode your sense of worth. You start to believe that your feelings don't matter, that your role in relationships is only to receive what others can't carry themselves. And if you already have a tendency towards self-sacrifice, you may even start to see this as noble. But it's not noble, it's corrosive. It creates a dynamic where you keep giving, hoping the mirror will eventually reflect something back, but it never does. The longer it goes on, the more invested you become in making it work. Because to admit the truth, that your care is not returned, feels like losing all the time, energy, and love you've poured in. Sometimes, the other person isn't malicious. They may simply lack the capacity for deep empathy. They might be too consumed by their own struggles, or they may have never learned how to be emotionally present for another person. Other times, the imbalance is deliberate. They take what you give because it's easy, because it costs them nothing, because they know you'll keep coming back. And here's the most dangerous part. The asymmetrical empathy trap can feel addictive. The more you give without return, the more you double down, as if trying to win a game that was never meant to be played fairly. You tell yourself that if you just care enough, if you just stay long enough, they'll see you the way you see them. But this is not a waiting game. It's a slow erosion. Breaking free begins with a brutal kind of honesty. You have to ask yourself, if I stop showing up for them, what would they do? If the answer is very little or nothing at all, then you're not in a mutual connection. You're in a one-way arrangement. And the longer you stay, the more you teach yourself that this is what you deserve. One woman told me she finally escaped this trap when she stopped answering calls for a week. "At first, I was terrified," she said. "I thought she'd show up at my door, worried, but she didn't call back. She didn't text. And that told me everything I needed to know. It hurt. But it was a clean hurt, the kind that comes from seeing the truth clearly." Escaping the asymmetrical empathy trap doesn't mean cutting off empathy. It means redirecting it toward places where it can flow both ways. It means surrounding yourself with people who not only take your hand when you're falling, but who also notice when your grip is slipping. It means understanding that your capacity for care is a gift, and gifts are meant to be given where they will be cherished, not exploited. Because in the end, empathy without reciprocity is not connection. It's consumption. And if you keep feeding someone who never feeds you back, you will starve while they thrive. The glass between you will always stay in place, reflecting only your own image while they remain untouched on the other side. Empathic armor formation. There comes a moment when empathy stops feeling like a bridge and starts feeling like an open wound you can no longer protect. At first, your ability to feel the emotions of others is something you cherish. You believe it is your strength, your gift, the thing that allows you to connect on a level beyond words. You carry other people's pain in your chest, as if it were your own, thinking that by holding it, you can help lighten their burden. But over time, you begin to realize that your chest is not bottomless, and each sorrow you hold leaves less room for your own breath. The transformation doesn't happen all at once. It begins with small, almost invisible adjustments. A slight softening of your voice so that it carries sympathy without revealing how much you're hurting. A carefully measured pause before you answer. Enough to choose the right words without letting your own feelings spill through. And slowly, without conscious intent, you begin to assemble a mask. A mask made of kindness, logic, and distance. You still care. You still show up. But you stop letting yourself be fully open. You listen, but you do not drown. You comfort, but you do not crumble. You've been hurt before by giving too much. Hurt in ways that left you raw for weeks. So you create something that can protect you. An invisible suit of armor that shields the tender, still living parts of your empathy. The first layer of that armor might form after betrayal. Maybe you were there for someone in their darkest hour, only for them to turn on you later, twisting your kindness into weakness. Or maybe it was the exhaustion of helping someone endlessly, only to realize they saw you not as a person, but as an endless well to draw from. Those memories stay sharp, and when the next plea for comfort comes, you instinctively keep one step back. Not far enough to be noticed, but far enough to keep the blade from reaching you. Layer after layer, the armor grows. A friend who disappeared when you needed them. A family member who mocked you for being too sensitive. A partner who used your compassion to manipulate you, feeding you their pain to avoid facing their own. Each incident reinforces the lesson. Unguarded empathy is dangerous, so you learn to hide it in plain sight. To outsiders, your armor looks like composure. They admire your ability to remain calm in the middle of chaos, to offer guidance without being overwhelmed by the emotions swirling around you. What they don't see is that calmness is not always serenity. It is calculation. It is the art of giving enough to appear fully present while holding the core of yourself at a safe distance. The paradox of empathic armor is that it saves you while also stealing from you. It allows you to survive in a world that can drain the unprotected heart. But it also mutes the colors of connection. You give enough to maintain the bond, but not enough to feel it in its full force. You protect your heart from breaking, but you also protect it from opening. Sometimes, the armor is so convincing you forget you're wearing it. You start to believe this version of yourself, the measured, controlled, untouchable self, is who you truly are. You tell yourself you've matured, that you've learned how to manage empathy. But then, without warning, a moment comes when someone's words slip past your defenses, and you feel a rush of raw emotion you thought was gone. It is then you remember, the armor didn't destroy your empathy. It just hid it. The danger is that armor, once built, doesn't know when to take itself off. You might keep it on even in the presence of those you love most. You might struggle to let your guard down even when you want to. You tell yourself it's for protection, but deep down, you fear that if you open fully again, you will drown in someone else's pain the way you once did. But the armor is not the enemy. It is a survival tool, forged in the fires of experience. The challenge is learning how to control it, when to raise the shield, and when to lay it aside. There are moments when you must step into the storm without protection, because some connections are worth the risk of being hurt. Consider the paramedic who responds to their 100th accident, the cries of the injured echoing in their ears just like the first time. But now, they move with a practiced steadiness, their face a mask of efficiency. Inside, they cannot afford to feel the full weight of every scream, every gasp for breath. Or, the teacher who listens to a student quietly hinting at trouble at home and offers comfort without letting herself imagine too deeply what that trouble might look like, because to do so would mean carrying it home, where it would keep her awake at night. And then there are the smaller, quieter moments. Sitting beside a friend who is breaking apart over a heartbreak, you keep your hand on their shoulder, but your thoughts just far enough away from the memory of your own heartbreak. Hearing a coworker talk about their parent's illness, you respond with empathy, but keep your mind from wandering to the thought of losing your own parents. These are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of self-preservation, honed over years of carrying too much. The armor is not always visible, even to you. Sometimes it feels like professionalism. Sometimes it feels like wisdom. And sometimes it feels like exhaustion, wearing the disguise of strength. But every so often, something pierces it. A moment of unguarded humanity that makes you realize how heavy the armor has become. A sudden tear in your eye during a film. A stranger's grief that catches you off guard. A hug from someone who simply says, "I know you care," and means it. Empathic armor is not about shutting out the world. It is about learning how to survive it. But survival alone is not the goal. The goal is to remain human enough to let the right moments in, even if they hurt. Because those moments are what remind you why you built the armor in the first place. Not to numb yourself to life, but to give yourself the chance to keep living it. Compassion, manipulation, loop. It always begins quietly. They don't walk into your life wearing a mask labeled manipulator. They come in soft, open, with stories that reach past your defenses. They tell you about the people who hurt them, the battles they fought, the nights they thought they wouldn't make it through. And because you have a heart that listens, you lean in. You offer understanding. You offer care. You offer yourself. And for a while it feels like you're doing good. You're being the safe place they never had, the voice of reassurance they were denied. You tell yourself, this is what empathy is for. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifts. The things they once told you to build trust, they now tell you to extract something. Your time, your energy, your choices. Their pain becomes currency. And every time you hesitate to give what they want, they slide it across the table like a reminder Remember what I've been through. Remember what you promised when you said you'd be there for me. This is the compassion manipulation loop. It works because it doesn't feel like manipulation at first. It feels like care. You want to help, and they make helping sound urgent, necessary, even heroic. They create a world where saying no doesn't feel like setting a boundary. It feels like betrayal. You begin to notice the patterns. The crisis always comes at the exact moment they sense you pulling away. The emotional confession drops when you need to make a decision they might not like. Their vulnerability is real enough to be convincing, but timed too perfectly to be accidental. The worst part? You can't point to a single moment where it turned from trust to control. It's like a fog that rolls in while you're asleep. You only realize how deep you are when you try to walk away and find you can't see the exit anymore. They know your empathy is a reflex, not a choice. They know you will picture them in pain if you don't give in. And so they make sure that every act of independence on your part comes with an unspoken cost: guilt. If you try to assert yourself, they remind you, directly or indirectly, of the times you helped them, as if those moments have locked you into an endless contract. If you take time for yourself, they hint at how lonely or abandoned they feel without you. You begin to feel that your care is no longer freely given. It is extracted. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. A sigh when you set a limit, a delayed response that feels heavy with disappointment. Other times, it's sharper. Accusations of being selfish, of forgetting what they've been through, of failing to be the person they thought you were. And because you are someone who feels deeply, you question yourself. You wonder if you are being selfish, if you're overreacting, if maybe you owe them more. That's how the loop tightens. Self-doubt becomes the chain they use to pull you back. Breaking the compassion manipulation loop is one of the hardest things an empathetic person can do, because it means confronting the possibility that your kindness has been weaponized. It means admitting that not everyone who opens up to you does so with pure intentions. It means recognizing that vulnerability can be a performance just as much as a truth. The danger isn't just in the control they gain, it's in the way they reshape you. Over time, you begin to associate empathy with danger, care with entrapment. You may even start to pull back from helping others entirely, afraid that every hand you hold will eventually tighten into a grip you can't escape. But there is a way out, and it begins with redefining what compassion means. Compassion is not compliance. It is not a blank check for someone else's needs. It is not measured by how much of yourself you give away. Real compassion includes yourself in its circle of care. That means setting boundaries without apology. It means recognizing when someone's crises always come with a script that benefits them. It means learning to see the difference between helping someone stand on their own and being the crutch they refuse to let go of. Yes, they may accuse you of being cold. Yes, they may paint you as the one who changed, who stopped caring. But that's because the version of you they want is not you. It's a resource they can control. Leaving the compassion manipulation loop is not an act of cruelty. It is the reclamation of your empathy for what it was always meant to be. A gift, not a leash. And when you take it back, you'll realize something they never wanted you to know. Your compassion is strongest not when it binds you to someone else's demands, but when it allows you to walk away without losing yourself. Performance empathy feedback. It begins with something small, a polite nod at a coworker's bad news, a practiced look of concern when a friend talks about their breakup. You know the right expressions, the right sounds to make, the right pauses between words. At first, it's harmless, a bit of social etiquette, a way to meet the unspoken expectation that you will respond with warmth. But over time, those gestures start replacing something deeper. You learn to wear empathy like a costume, slipping it on in conversation after conversation. You know exactly how to look into someone's eyes with just enough softness, how to tilt your head at the right angle, how to let your voice lower into that perfect, I understand tone. You become so good at performing care that no one notices when the care itself begins to thin. This is performance empathy feedback, the loop where empathy becomes a reflexive performance, encouraged by how convincingly you play the role until you no longer remember what it felt like to actually mean it. It's reinforced because people reward the performance. They thank you for listening. They call you such a good friend. They confide in you more. And with each confession, you give the same well-practiced response. They leave feeling heard, but you leave feeling nothing. And that nothing starts to worry you until it becomes the new normal. The danger is subtle. You begin to measure your success in empathy, not by what you feel, but by how others respond. If they smile through their tears, you must have done it right. If they say you're kind, you must have been. And yet, when you lie in bed at night replaying the conversation, you realize you can't recall a single moment when their pain actually touched you. It can happen to therapists after years of sessions, to customer service workers fielding endless emotional calls, to friends who have been the listener in every group for as long as they can remember. The repetition teaches the body to mimic empathy without engaging the heart. And because it works, because the performance achieves the desired social result, you get trapped in the feedback loop. Over time, you might even start to distrust your own genuine feelings. When you do care deeply, it feels almost like an act. You wonder, am I actually moved by this, or am I just playing the part I've been playing for years? That doubt erodes the boundary between authentic emotion and the habit of acting, breaking out of performance empathy. Feedback isn't easy because it asks you to slow down in moments where the world expects speed. Real empathy doesn't happen on autopilot. It requires you to pause, to sit in the discomfort of actually feeling what someone else feels, and to risk being changed by it. That risk is what the performance protects you from. Sometimes the way back to real feeling starts small, letting yourself sit in silence with someone without rushing to fill it. Admitting when you don't know what to say instead of reaching for a scripted line. Allowing your face to react naturally instead of shaping it into what you think they need to see. Giving yourself permission to feel the weight of the moment, even if it slows everything down. Because empathy, when stripped of performance, is unpredictable. It doesn't always arrive neatly. Sometimes it's messy, awkward, or incomplete. But that rawness is what makes it real. Performance empathy feedback thrives on polish, on making compassion smooth and flawless. Real empathy thrives on imperfection, on the quiet moments when you're clumsy with your care, but honest. And maybe that's the test. If your empathy always looks perfect, it might not be empathy at all. The truth is, people don't just need your words or your expressions. They need the part of you that's willing to be moved, unsettled, even undone by their pain. Without that, all you're giving them is a reflection of what compassion should look like. And over time, if you keep giving that instead of yourself, you may forget what it feels like to actually mean it. Stranger bond glitch. Sometimes, connection does not follow the rules we expect. You would think that the deepest bonds are forged with those closest to us. Family, lifelong friends, the people who share our history. And yet, there are moments when a stranger's pain feels sharper, more urgent, more real to you than the suffering of those you've known for years. It is disorienting, even guilt-inducing. You wonder why your heart reaches so quickly across an unfamiliar face, yet stumbles when confronted with the grief of your own blood. This is the stranger bond glitch, when your empathy bypasses proximity and history, and instead locks onto something less tangible. Resonance. It's as if certain souls hum at a frequency that matches yours, even if you've never exchanged a word. You might not know their name, but in their pain, you recognize something that feels like your own. It can happen anywhere. On a train, you glance at someone staring out the window, eyes red, shoulders tight. You don't know their story, but your chest aches. At a funeral for someone you barely knew, you find yourself crying harder for the grief etched into the face of a distant cousin's friend than you ever have for certain members of your own family. Or you see a photograph in the news of a disaster victim half a world away, and their expression pierces you in a way your own siblings' struggles never have. This is not about love, loyalty, or moral worth. It's about the strange physics of emotional resonance. Some pains match your inner blueprint more closely, even if they come from a life nothing like yours. Sometimes, the familiarity is hidden. You may not consciously see your own past reflected in theirs, but your body reacts as if you've been here before. The connection bypasses logic, bypasses history, and goes straight to the nerve. Psychologists might call it projection. You see a stranger's suffering, and without realizing it, you fill in their backstory with elements of your own. If you've known loneliness, you might feel it acutely when you spot it in another's posture. If you've been betrayed, you might detect the smallest flicker of that same hurt in someone's tone, and it hits harder than a family member's more obvious pain. And yet, the stranger bond glitch also raises uncomfortable questions about proximity. We are told that closeness should intensify empathy, that the more you know someone, the more you care. But in reality, familiarity can dull the edge of compassion. You get used to their suffering. You see the same struggles play out over years, and you develop a tolerance to them, much like you stop hearing a clock ticking in your own room. A stranger's pain, by contrast, is pure, unfiltered, new. It shocks you into feeling. There is also less baggage with strangers. No tangled history, no unresolved conflicts, no competing emotions. With family, empathy can be knotted with frustration, resentment, or fatigue. With strangers, your compassion is unburdened. You can give it freely without the weight of years pressing on it. That freedom can make it burn brighter. Consider the story of Lena, who had grown distant from her brother after years of tension. When he lost his job, she listened politely, offered help, but felt little urgency. Yet, one afternoon she saw a woman crying quietly in a cafe, phone in hand, staring at a rejection email. Lena felt tears sting her eyes. She didn't know the woman, but she felt compelled to comfort her, to close the distance between them. She left the cafe shaken, not just by the stranger's pain, but by the realization that it had moved her more deeply than her own brother's. The stranger bond. Glitch is not a failure of morality. It's a reminder that empathy does not obey the tidy hierarchies we assign it. It is unpredictable, sometimes inconvenient. It can connect you to someone for a single moment and change you in ways your oldest relationships never have. It can leave you wondering if bonds are less about time and more about the invisible threads of resonance that run between certain people. And yet, it can also teach you something vital about yourself. The strangers who move you most deeply may be mirrors for the parts of you that are most in need of acknowledgement. They can reflect wounds you've ignored, dreams you've buried, or truths you've been unwilling to face. Their pain becomes a doorway, not just into their humanity, but into your own. The challenge is not to choose between caring for strangers and caring for those close to you, but to recognize when resonance is guiding your heart and when habit is dulling it, to ask why a stranger's cry cuts deeper and whether that sharpness can be carried back into the relationships that have grown muted over time. Because sometimes, the soul you've never met speaks to you more clearly than the ones you've known forever. And in that glitch, there is both a mystery and a chance to remember that empathy at its core is not about distance at all, but about the rare electric moment when two frequencies align. Empathy-induced identity, loss. It starts as a kindness, a willingness to meet people where they are, to shape yourself into the exact kind of presence they need. With one person, you are light and optimistic, a source of hope. With another, you are quiet and steady, a place of rest. With someone else, you become sharp and fiercely protective. You adjust without thinking. You adapt without effort. And it feels good to be what people need, until one day you realize you no longer know what you need. Empathy is supposed to connect you to others, but, for some, it becomes a kind of shape-shifting, an endless restructuring of the self to accommodate other people's wounds. You take on their language, their tone, their worldview. You learn their fears so well that you start preemptively protecting them, even from problems they haven't noticed yet. And slowly, without realizing it, you become less a person and more a mirror, reflecting what others need to see. At first, this feels like purpose. You are the one who can hold space for grief without flinching, who can absorb rage without retaliating, who can wrap your voice around someone's shame until it feels smaller. You are the one people call at 3 a.m. because you can make chaos feel manageable. And when they thank you, you believe the thank you is proof that you're living right. But there's a cost. Every time you bend yourself into someone else's shape, you shave away a part of your own. You make yourself a little quieter, a little smaller, to make room for their voice. You adjust your beliefs so their pain feels justified. You change your reactions so they won't feel judged. And after years of this, you find that the pieces you've given away don't grow back. You are left with a self that is a collage of everyone else's needs, but not your own. One man described it as wearing other people's lives like clothes. For years, he molded himself to fit whatever his friends or partners needed, adopting their hobbies, their values, even their opinions about the world. It wasn't manipulation. It was empathy taken to an extreme. He said, "It was like I could step into someone's emotional skin so completely that I'd forget to step back out. After a while, I didn't know which thoughts were mine and which I'd borrowed." The danger of empathy-induced identity loss is that it's self-reinforcing. The more you define yourself by your ability to heal others, the more you seek out people who need healing. And the more you surround yourself with the wounded, the more you shape yourself to fit them. You start to believe that your worth exists only in the context of someone else's pain. Without a crisis to manage, you feel directionless, like an actor waiting for the next scene. This is why some people in this cycle struggle with healthy, reciprocal relationships. In balanced connections, there is no emergency to respond to, no constant wound to tend. And without that dynamic, you feel unneeded, so you unconsciously seek out situations where you can step into the role of healer again. Over time, this can lead to a quiet addiction to other people's suffering. You don't want them to hurt, but you also don't know who you are if they stop. Psychologically, this erasure of self is a form of over-identification. The boundaries between you and the other blur until they become a single field of emotion, and your own experiences get pushed to the edges. You might even find yourself mimicking their posture, their speech patterns, their expressions, not as an act of imitation, but as an unconscious merging. You become the shape they need, and in doing so, you lose the shape you are. Breaking this cycle is harder than it sounds, because it means stepping out of the role that has given you meaning. It means letting go of the belief that your value comes from fixing people. It means facing the discomfort of being with someone's pain without rearranging yourself to absorb it. And perhaps hardest of all, it means figuring out who you are when there's no one to heal. One woman told me she spent a full year avoiding any new friendships after leaving a toxic relationship. "I needed to find out what I was like when I wasn't trying to be anyone's medicine," she said. She discovered that some of her tastes, hobbies, and beliefs weren't truly hers. They were leftovers from the people she'd cared for. "I had to relearn myself," she said, and that was both terrifying and liberating. To recover from empathy-induced identity loss, you have to treat yourself like someone worth caring for, not just someone who cares. That means setting boundaries that protect your sense of self, even if it feels selfish at first. It means noticing when you start to change your opinions or behaviors to keep someone else comfortable, and choosing, deliberately, to hold your ground. It means practicing the radical act of showing up in relationships as your whole self, even if it means some people won't stay. Because the truth is, the most powerful empathy doesn't erase you. It includes you. It's not about becoming whatever someone else needs. It's about being fully yourself in the presence of their pain. That's the kind of empathy that heals without disappearing. And in the end, if you can remember who you are when no one is asking for your help, you'll know you've escaped the trap. You'll still care. You'll still feel. But you'll finally be living in your own skin instead of wearing someone else's. Distant disaster, displacement. There is a strange and unsettling reflex in the human heart to pour your grief, outrage, and compassion into tragedies that are unfolding far from your own life, while the struggles in your immediate world remain untouched. You might sit at your kitchen table, scrolling through images of destruction on the other side of the planet, feeling tears prick your eyes. You post about it, donate what you can, talk to friends about how unbearable it is. And yet, at that same table, bills go unpaid, a relationship remains fractured, or your own mental health quietly declines. At first glance, this may look like hypocrisy, but it is something more complex, and in many ways, more human. Distant disaster displacement happens when our empathy seeks refuge in the suffering of strangers, because their pain, though real, carries no direct demand on our personal reality. The devastation moves us deeply, but it remains safely abstract. We can mourn for them without having to dismantle the structures of our own lives. The tragedies close to home are often messier. They require involvement that goes beyond words or donations. Your friend's spiraling mental health might mean late-night phone calls, uncomfortable conversations, the risk of saying the wrong thing. Your own financial instability might mean confronting years of unmade choices. A broken relationship might mean swallowing pride, apologizing, or walking away. These are wounds that cut too close, and sometimes it is easier to tend to the bleeding of the world than the bleeding of your own life. Another reason this displacement happens is the clarity of distant suffering, a flood, a war, an earthquake. They present themselves in sharp images and clear narratives. There is no ambiguity about whether it is bad enough to deserve compassion. But in your own life, the pain can be blurry. It might be mixed with resentment, guilt, or the knowledge that you played a part in causing it. The faraway tragedy offers emotional purity. You can feel for them without the complication of feeling about yourself. There is also a kind of moral performance involved, though often unconscious. Public grief for distant disasters allows you to be seen as compassionate without revealing the raw, tangled vulnerabilities of your own life. You can post about a wildfire without mentioning the fire slowly burning through your marriage. You can share articles about famine without admitting you haven't called your own mother in months. Caring about the faraway is socially safe. It earns approval, not awkward silence. This is not to say the grief you feel for strangers is fake. It is real. The images that haunt you are real. The ache you feel when you hear their stories is real, but it is also true that this grief can become a shield. It lets you channel the urge to care into a space where your heart can open without being personally exposed. There is danger in letting displacement become your default. If all your emotional energy is spent on crises you cannot touch, you may find yourself drained when it comes to the ones you can. The people in your immediate life, the ones whose pain could be eased by your presence, end up receiving less of you than the strangers across the ocean. Imagine a neighbor who loses their spouse. You send a sympathy card and tell yourself you've done enough, but you never knock on their door, never offer to sit with them in the silence of their grief. At the same time, you are deeply engaged in raising funds for victims of a tsunami in another country. Both forms of care matter, but only one of them asks you to show up physically, to risk the awkwardness of being present in someone's pain, and that is the one we often avoid. Consider the person who cries over images of children in refugee camps, but hasn't spoken to their own estranged child in years, or the one who follows every breaking update about a collapsed mine in another country, but ignores the crumbling emotional foundation of their own household. These are not acts of deliberate neglect. They are evasions born from fear. It is easier to care for those you cannot reach than to risk failing those you can. There is also a strange intoxication in the unity that distant tragedies create. For a brief moment, everyone is looking in the same direction, speaking the same language of sorrow. You can join that chorus without having to reveal the private aches you carry. It feels like belonging without the cost of vulnerability. Meanwhile, the person in your life who is silently struggling might never become part of such a public wave of support. And so, their pain remains invisible, even to you. Yet, there is a profound cost to this displacement that few recognize until it is too late. The people closest to you may begin to feel like background characters in a story where your most passionate compassion is reserved for strangers. Your child remembers that you cried for the earthquake victims on television, but didn't ask about their bad day. Your partner recalls your fury over political violence overseas, but not your willingness to sit and listen when they were quietly breaking inside. The truth is, distant grief is clean, but local grief is messy. And it is in that mess, awkward, imperfect, and sometimes painfully slow, that the deepest connections are forged. By avoiding it, you protect yourself from discomfort, but you also rob yourself of intimacy. This does not mean you should stop caring for the suffering far away. The world needs that care. But the challenge, the real act of courage, is to split your empathy, to let it stretch across oceans without forgetting to cross the street, to speak up for those far away while speaking directly to those nearby, to send aid to strangers while offering your presence to friends. Because one day, the disaster will not be distant. It will knock on your own door. And when it does, you will understand that the truest test of compassion is not how far it can reach, but how close it can stay. Amplified pain mirror. It happens so fast you almost miss it. A friend, a partner, a stranger on the edge of tears. Someone comes to you with a weight in their chest, a story pressing at the edges of their voice. You sit with them. You lean forward. You let their words pour into the space between you. You offer quiet nods, the right questions, the warmth in your tone that tells them it's safe to spill what they have been holding back. And slowly you see it happen. Their breathing evens, their shoulders drop, the storm in their eyes begins to calm. By the time you part ways, they look lighter, their voice brighter, their face softer. You know you've helped them, but when you're alone, you realize something's wrong. The heaviness they walked in with is now sitting inside you. This is the amplified pain mirror. It's the strange, invisible exchange where your care absorbs the very thing they needed to let go of. And instead of dissipating, it takes root in you. Like a lightning rod, you've grounded their strike, channeling the force away from them, only to feel it burn through your own skin. At first, you might not notice the transfer. You tell yourself you're just tired. But then, hours later, the echo of their pain is still vibrating through your thoughts. Their grief mixes with your own memories. Their anger replays in your chest like it belongs to you. And the worst part, you can't hand it back. You've taken something from them, and there's nowhere for it to go except deeper into you. Some people call this emotional absorption. Others call it empathetic overload. But in the amplified pain mirror, it's not just that you take on their pain. You intensify it, because you don't carry it as they did. You carry it as yourself. Your mind weaves it into your own fears, your own insecurities, and your own unresolved wounds. What was theirs alone becomes a storm fed by the weather systems of your own heart. It's why some helpers, healers, and good listeners burn out without understanding why. They're not just supporting others. They're storing the discharged pain in their own emotional archives. Over time, those archives grow heavy. You can see it in the small signs. After comforting someone, you find yourself replaying the conversation over and over. You notice your body feels tense in the same way theirs did. You feel inexplicably drained after brief interactions, even when nothing bad happened to you. And the next day, when you see them smiling, a strange resentment creeps in. Not because you wanted them to stay sad, but because they walked away lighter while you walked away heavier. The mirror part is unavoidable for deeply empathetic people. We reflect back the emotions we see, often without meaning to. But the amplification happens when we don't let those reflections fade, when we let them stick, refract, and multiply until they feel bigger than the original source. And here's the cruel truth. The person you helped may never know. To them, you were the anchor in their storm, the listener who lifted the weight. They might not realize that you're now carrying a version of that weight, heavier, sharper, more tangled than when they gave it away. This loop can erode your boundaries without you noticing. You begin to dread certain conversations, not because you don't care, but because you know the cost of caring too deeply. You may even start avoiding people who need you, ashamed of your own reluctance to help. The solution isn't to stop caring, it's to change how you receive. A mirror doesn't have to hold the reflection forever. It can let the image fade once the moment has passed. That means learning to listen without keeping, to connect without absorbing. It's not detachment, it's sustainable empathy. Some find rituals for release, writing down the weight and burning the paper, walking in silence until the echo of the conversation fades, grounding themselves with something physical and present. Others set invisible limits, gently redirecting conversations before they slide into territory they can't shake off later. Because here's the truth. Your compassion is too valuable to be used as a dumping ground. If you let every lightning strike anchor in your chest, you'll eventually burn from the inside out. The amplified pain mirror teaches a hard lesson. Being someone's safe place does not mean sacrificing your own safety. You can help someone feel lighter without taking their darkness into your bones. You can let the storm pass through you without letting it settle inside you. And when you learn to do that, you'll still be the mirror, but one that reflects without breaking. Empathy, withdrawal, reaction. It begins with exhaustion, the kind that isn't fixed by sleep. You've been carrying other people's stories for so long, holding space for every tear, every confession, every late-night message, that somewhere along the way, your own capacity began to thin. At first, you push through. You tell yourself you can handle it, that you've always been the one who listens, the one who cares. But quietly, the well inside you starts to dry, and then, one day, you stop. Not completely, not in some dramatic declaration, but in small, almost invisible ways. You let the phone ring instead of answering. You type and delete a reply to a long message, deciding you'll respond later, and later never comes. You change the subject when a conversation starts drifting toward pain. You withhold the soft words you used to give freely. This is the empathy withdrawal reaction, the self-protective retreat from caring, born from the need to survive your own emotional fatigue. It is not cruelty. It is not malice. It is the nervous system quietly saying, enough. But the moment you step back, another feeling takes its place. Guilt. The guilt comes in waves. You remember the times they leaned on you, and you were there, fully there, heart open. You remember how much it meant to them, and now, when you notice yourself turning away, a voice in your head whispers that you're failing them, that you're selfish, cold, abandoning the very people who counted on you. The worst part is how invisible the struggle is to others. From the outside, they may only see that you've become quieter, less involved. They might assume you're busy, distracted, preoccupied, but inside, you're painfully aware that it's not distraction, it's avoidance. You're protecting the little strength you have left, afraid that if you give any more, there will be nothing of you left at all, the empathy withdrawal. Reaction often follows prolonged periods of overextension, caregivers who have been on call for years, friends who have become the emotional anchor for their entire circle, parents who give endlessly without replenishment. Over time, empathy stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a demand you can't meet without losing yourself. The irony is that the guilt can be just as draining as the empathy itself. You replay moments when you could have been there and weren't. You imagine them wondering why you've changed. And sometimes, you even force yourself back into the role, offering care while knowing you're only half present, just to silence the guilt. But that kind of care feels hollow, and you can sense that they can feel the difference. The way through isn't to shame yourself into giving more. It's to understand that withdrawal can be a form of maintenance. Stepping back doesn't mean you've stopped caring. It means you're trying to keep the part of you that can care alive. Empathy is a resource, and like any resource, it depletes when overused without renewal. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for others is to protect your own ability to feel for them. That might mean setting firmer boundaries, saying, "I can't talk about this right now," or letting them know you need space. It might mean allowing yourself to be the one who receives care for a change. It might mean remembering that you are not the sole guardian of anyone's healing. The guilt will still come because you're wired to connect, to help. But over time, you can learn to see withdrawal not as abandonment, but as a pause, a necessary silence in which your empathy can breathe again. Because when you return, and you will, you'll return with something real to give, not just the shadow of what you used to feel, and that difference is everything. Mirror neuron recoil. Sometimes, the body feels what the mind refuses to acknowledge. You hear someone's voice crack as they speak of loss, and without thinking, your own throat tightens. You see the tremble in their hands, and your fingers curl slightly, as if bracing for impact. This is not imagination. It is the silent work of mirror neurons, those specialized brain cells that blur the line between watching and experiencing. They fire when you act, and they fire again when you see someone else act. They don't just observe, they participate. And when the thing you are witnessing is emotional pain, they make your body feel its echo. But there is a darker side to this wiring. When the emotional pain you witness is too heavy to face directly, your mind may shield you from fully feeling it. You tell yourself you are fine. You stay composed, collected, the picture of control. Yet, your body has already taken the hit. Your muscles tense, your breath shortens, your heart rate shifts, and somewhere deep inside, a trace of that grief lodges itself in you. This is mirror neuron recoil. When your nervous system absorbs pain, you never consciously process, storing it in muscles, posture, and breath until it becomes part of you. It can begin in the smallest moments. A friend describes the last night they spent with a dying parent. You listen quietly, nodding, even offering comfort. But later, when you try to sleep, your chest feels heavy, as though something invisible has settled there. You cannot name it, but it's real. Or, you pass a stranger in the park, sitting motionless on a bench, clutching an empty dog leash. You glance away, unwilling to intrude, but hours later, you find your stomach knotted, as though you've been grieving with them. These reactions are not weakness, they are biology. Mirror neurons are designed to help us learn, connect, and survive. They are the reason you instinctively flinch when someone else stumbles, the reason you feel your jaw tighten when someone shouts in rage, the reason your eyes water when you watch a stranger cry. The brain doesn't just register their sadness, it partially simulates it. Your muscles, breath, and even internal chemistry shift to match theirs. This is empathy on a cellular level. But when the mind refuses to engage with what the body has already mirrored, the result is stored, unprocessed tension. Over time, this stored grief can accumulate. You might start waking with tight shoulders, clenching your jaw at night, or feeling inexplicably drained. You might avoid certain places or people without understanding why. These are echoes of the pains you've absorbed, moments you never fully allowed yourself to feel, but never fully let go of either. Like unclaimed luggage, they sit in the corners of your body, waiting. Consider the story of a nurse who spends 20 years in an intensive care unit. She cannot afford to break down with every patient. She learns to keep her expression neutral, her voice steady, her hands firm. But her body is still recording every tremor in a voice, every squeeze of a hand, every final breath. By the time she retires, her body carries the grief of hundreds of strangers, grief she never consciously processed but never escaped. Or think of a child growing up in a tense household, watching a parent silently endure sadness or frustration. That child might never hear the words, but they feel it. The stiffness in a hug, the sigh at the dinner table. They don't know what's wrong, but their body starts to mirror it. And without guidance, that mirrored tension follows them into adulthood, woven into the way they react to people without understanding why. The recoil is not always immediate. Sometimes it waits. You might be fine in the moment, but weeks later, a similar sound, smell, or gesture unlocks the stored grief, flooding you with a sorrow that feels sudden and irrational. In truth, it is neither sudden nor irrational. It is simply delayed. The body is patient. It will hold on to what the mind will not face, and it will deliver it back to you when something cracks the seal. And the strangest part is that your mind may not even connect the feeling to its source. You might think you are having a bad day, when in reality you are carrying pieces of other people's bad days, woven into your own body's memory. You become a silent archive of the world's unspoken grief. This is why awareness matters. To notice the way your body responds in the presence of pain is to give yourself the chance to release it before it roots too deeply. It can be as simple as pausing to breathe deeply when you feel your shoulders tense, or letting yourself cry when a story touches you instead of swallowing it down. It is the difference between letting an emotion pass through you and letting it live in you. Because if you ignore the recoil long enough, it shapes you. You may become more guarded, less open, not out of choice, but because your body is already full. Your capacity for connection shrinks, not because your heart is closed, but because your nervous system has no more room to store what it refuses to process. Mirror neuron recoil is the hidden cost of being open to the world. It is the proof that empathy is not just an idea, it is a physical act, etched into your muscles, breath, and bones. And if you want to keep carrying others without losing yourself, you must learn not just how to care, but how to let go. Empathy, fairness, paradox. It begins with something simple, a refusal to shut your heart where others have bolted theirs. You hear a story of harm, of cruelty, of injustice, and you feel the victim's pain like it's your own. The weight of it sinks into you, heavy and raw. But then you hear the other side. Not to excuse, not to condone, but because you want to understand. You listen to the person everyone has already condemned, the one they call a monster. And to your surprise, you feel something for them too. Not agreement, not approval, but a recognition of their humanity, fractured as it may be. At first, you think this is what empathy is meant to do. Cross the chasms others won't. You believe that caring equally for both sides is the only way to truly understand the whole picture. And so, you do it openly. You speak of the pain on both ends of the wound. You mention the childhood trauma of the perpetrator in the same breath as the suffering of the victim. You insist that even the ones who have done wrong were once innocent. That's when the accusations start. They don't hear fairness, they hear betrayal. Your compassion for the wrong person becomes, in their eyes, a denial of the victim's pain. They don't see that you are holding both griefs in the same hands. They only see that you've let your fingers touch the one they believe should be cast out entirely. You try to explain. You say that empathy isn't the same as agreement, that to understand isn't to absolve, that humanizing someone who has done harm doesn't erase accountability. It simply acknowledges that no one is born a villain. But your words fall flat. People have already decided that your empathy has crossed into treachery. A teacher once told me about a student who had committed a violent act at school. The staff meetings were full of anger, and rightfully so. The victim was badly hurt. But when the teacher mentioned that the perpetrator had been homeless, abused, and neglected for most of his life, the room went cold. Later, colleagues pulled her aside and said, "You're defending him." She wasn't. She was mourning that such a path had led to such an act. But to them, her ability to feel for both sides meant she had picked the wrong one. This is the empathy-fairness paradox. The more equally you care, the more likely it is that someone will believe you've taken a side. And paradoxically, the side they'll think you've taken is the one they consider unworthy of care. The human mind craves simplicity, heroes and villains, innocence and guilt. But empathy is rarely so neat. True empathy refuses to collapse people into a single act, refuses to strip away the complexity of their existence. It knows that a victim can be flawed, that a perpetrator can be broken in ways that explain, though never excuse, the harm they cause. And in a world built on outrage and allegiance, this kind of empathy is seen not as a virtue, but as a threat. The danger is that, under enough pressure, you start to pull back. You learn to hide the side of your compassion that doesn't fit the script. You speak only for the safe half of the story. You edit out the parts that might get you accused of disloyalty. And slowly you betray the very principle that made you care in the first place, that every life has a depth worth seeing. Breaking free from the empathy-fairness paradox means accepting the loneliness that comes with it. It means knowing you will be misunderstood, misjudged, even despised for refusing to dehumanize anyone, no matter what they've done. It means holding your ground when people tell you that kindness toward the wrong person is cruelty toward the right one. Because empathy, at its purest, is not about picking sides. It's about refusing to let humanity be conditional. And if that makes you suspect in the eyes of those who demand clean divisions, so be it. You will have chosen the harder road, the one that sees everyone, even when no one wants them to be seen. In the end, fairness and empathy is not a weakness. It's a quiet rebellion against the world's hunger for enemies. It's the act of saying, I will not let my compassion be dictated by the crime, the label, or the verdict. I will see you, even when everyone else looks away. And if that costs me the approval of those who think empathy must have a favorite, then I will bear that cost. Because empathy that chooses only the deserving isn't empathy at all. Intergenerational empathy. Echo. There are sorrows you carry that were never truly yours. They live in your body like half-remembered dreams, shadows without source, aches without cause. You have never met the people they belong to, and yet their weight presses on you as if carved into your bones. This is the intergenerational empathy echo, the strange inheritance of grief passed down through blood, memory, and the quiet spaces between words. It begins before you were born. Your grandparents, your great-grandparents, perhaps even those before them, lived through losses and horrors you will never fully know. Wars that stole their youth, famines that hollowed out entire villages, displacements that tore families from the land they had tended for centuries. They endured, they adapted, and they built lives again. But survival is not the same as healing. Some wounds never closed. They were simply folded into the fabric of who they were. And in the most mysterious way, they were folded into you. Scientists are beginning to understand how trauma can leave marks that outlast the moment itself. Not just in memory, but in the body. Changes in stress hormones, in the way genes express themselves, in the chemistry of the brain, all quietly passed from parent to child. This is not the inheritance of a story, but of a state of being. You may find yourself reacting to danger faster than seems reasonable, feeling grief in situations that do not warrant it, or carrying an unshakable sense of loss even in times of safety. You may call it anxiety, melancholy, or sensitivity, but in truth, it may be history speaking through your veins. But biology is only part of the echo. The rest comes through culture, through the way pain is remembered or avoided in a family. You grow up hearing certain stories told again and again, their edges worn smooth by repetition. Or you grow up hearing nothing, the silence itself becoming a kind of presence. Either way, you absorb the emotional weight. Your grandmother's fear of scarcity becomes your own caution, even if your pantry is full. Your grandfather's quiet sadness becomes the lens through which you see the world, even if your own life has been untouched by such loss. Sometimes, the echo is obvious. You visit the place where your ancestors lived and feel an inexplicable pull, a heaviness in your chest, as if the soil remembers your blood. Other times, it is subtle, a recurring dream of a place you've never been, or a sudden wave of sorrow triggered by a song in a language you don't speak. You can dismiss it as imagination, but deep down you feel the truth. Some part of you is remembering something your own life never lived. The paradox of the intergenerational empathy echo is that you can feel grief for events that ended decades before you were born, yet remain untouched by the full details of your own history. You may weep for the suffering of an ancestor whose name you don't even know, You may find yourself mourning for a tragedy you cannot describe, and you may never know whether you are honoring their pain or simply trapped in it. This inheritance can be both a burden and a gift. It can weigh you down, making you feel as though you are living with a sadness that has no clear origin and no clear cure. But it can also connect you to something larger than yourself, a lineage of resilience, survival, and continuity. To feel the echo is to be reminded that your life did not begin at your birth. You are the continuation of stories older than your name. Imagine a woman who has never known hunger, yet feels a pang of anxiety every time she throws away food. She grew up in a home where meals were carefully measured, where plates were cleaned to the last crumb, not because they were poor, but because her grandmother had survived a famine. That fear of scarcity lived on, unspoken, shaping habits generations later. Or a man who has never seen war, yet startles at sudden loud noises, his heart racing as if he were under attack. He does not remember his grandfather crouching in a trench, but the echoes of that fear still ripple through his nervous system. He carries it not as memory, but as reflex. Sometimes, the echo is passed down in words. A father tells his children about the night his parents fled their home with nothing but a suitcase. The children grow up with an unshakable sense that stability is temporary, that safety can vanish overnight. Other times, the echo is passed down in silence, trauma buried so deeply that no one speaks of it, but everyone feels it. The family avoids certain topics, certain places, without explanation, as if by instinct. The most haunting part of the intergenerational empathy echo is that it can make you feel grief without context. You may cry at films depicting events that bear no relation to your life, only to realize later that your ancestors lived through something eerily similar. You may feel a profound connection to strangers whose lives mirror the struggles your family once endured, as if your blood recognizes their story, even when your mind does not. There is a strange duality in carrying this kind of empathy. On one hand, it can make you profoundly compassionate, able to understand suffering without needing to experience it firsthand. On the other, it can feel like living with a ghost, a weight you cannot name, a sadness you cannot fully explain. But the echo does not exist only to burden you. It is also a signal, a reminder that your existence is part of a chain that stretches back through time. Every choice you make, every life you touch, has the potential to either continue the echo of pain or transform it into something new. You may never erase what was passed down, but you can decide what you will pass forward. To work with the echo is to become both historian and healer, researching the stories that shaped your family, listening for the emotions between the lines, and then choosing which parts of that inheritance to keep alive. Some echoes deserve to be amplified: courage, perseverance, solidarity. Others must be softened so that future generations inherit not the wound, but the wisdom. You are not only the echo, you are also the voice that decides how it will sound in the next generation's ears. And perhaps the greatest act of empathy you can offer your ancestors is to ensure that their pain does not have to be relived, only remembered, honored, and finally set free.